Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. The letter arrived in an old-fashioned envelope, the kind with frayed edges and yellowed paper that made the postmark seem like something pulled from the past. It was hand-delivered. There was no stamp, no postage, just the neat, almost too perfect handwriting that spilled across the surface like an invitation to a mystery she couldn't yet fathom. Fiona had been blind for over 10 years. At first, the world had been nothing more than darkness, a vast, endless black void that swallowed everything she had known. It hadn't been the sudden onset of blindness that had broken her, though. It was the slow, suffocating loss, the gradual fading of colors, the soft diminishing of details, until one day nothing was left. No more street signs, no more sunsets. The faces of those she loved were mere shadows to her, blurred fragments of something she could barely recall. In time, her blindness had become an old companion, one that she'd learned to live with, hadn't she? Still, the letter. It had arrived on the anniversary of her diagnosis, and she couldn't shake the feeling that its timing was deliberate. The writing on the envelope felt different somehow, stiff, unnervingly formal. Fiona's hands trembled as she opened it, fingers brushing against the embossed edges of the card that fell into her lap. It was an invitation, an offer, a gift that restores vision, a chance to see the world once more. Come to the shop on Main Street. You've been chosen. Your sight awaits. Her pulse quickened as she read the words. A gift, a chance, a promise. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years dreaming of this, of waking up to the world, of seeing her daughter's face again, of experiencing the colors and shapes that had been stolen from her. The thought of it made her heart race, and for a moment, her fingers felt clammy against the edges of the paper. It wasn't a question of whether or not she would go. She had to. She couldn't help herself. The shop on Main Street wasn't a place Fiona had ever noticed before. She had walked the streets of her town countless times, feeling the pulse of life around her, listening to the world's rhythm. But this shop, it had always been a blind spot, a place she never sensed, never knew existed. How had she missed it? Was it possible she'd passed it every day and simply never paid attention? It was small, tucked between two taller buildings that loomed over it like watchful sentinels. The faded sign above the door read, Riverside Curiosities, and even though she couldn't see it, she felt an odd shiver run down her spine. There was something unsettling about the name, something that whispered of strange things, forgotten things, things that shouldn't be. But then again, who could blame her for feeling that way? A letter had just promised her the impossible. She was a woman who had lived her life in darkness, and now someone, somewhere, was offering her a chance to take it all back. The weight of the decision seemed to settle over her like a fog. Fiona hesitated for just a moment before she reached for the brass door handle, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. The door creaked open with a sigh, the sound almost too loud in the otherwise silent street. Inside, the air smelled old, musty, but with a faint undertone of something sweet, something like rose petals. She stepped across the threshold, her cane tapping softly against the floor, her ears straining for any hint of human presence. The shop was dimly lit, shelves lined with objects that seemed to come from another time. Old books with cracked spines, porcelain dolls with blank eyes, faded photographs. But it wasn't the objects themselves that caught her attention. It was the stillness, the kind of silence that felt like it had been in place for far too long. The kind of silence that seeped into the bones, that pressed against your chest, making every breath feel heavier than the last. Behind the counter stood a man. His back was to her, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he knew she was there, but hadn't yet acknowledged her presence. He was tall, with dark hair that was almost too neat and combed, and the pale skin of someone who hadn't seen much sun in their lifetime. As she approached, her cane still tapping softly on the worn floorboards, she noticed the way he seemed to blend with the shadows of the room, as if he were part of the shop itself, an extension of the strange energy that hummed quietly in the corners. "I see you've come," the man said without turning around, his voice deep and steady, almost too calm for the circumstances. "You've made the right choice." Fiona froze. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no way he could have known she was the one the letter referred to. It wasn't possible. And yet, there it was, his certainty ringing in her ears, like a bell tolling in the distance. What is this place?" she asked, her voice hesitant but firm. She wasn't sure if she was more frightened or fascinated by what was unfolding before her. The man turned, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. He smiled, though there was something unnatural about the curve of his lips, something unsettling in the way his expression remained perfectly still, as though it were painted onto his face. "It's a place where the impossible becomes possible," he said softly, his words heavy with a weight she couldn't explain. "Where people like you can receive what they've always longed for." Fiona took a deep breath. She had come this far. What was the worst that could happen? "I received a letter," she said. "It said you had something for me. A gift." His smile widened, just a fraction, and he reached beneath the counter to pull out a small velvet box. He placed it in front of her, the fabric smooth beneath her fingertips. It felt wrong somehow. Too smooth. Too otherworldly. "You were chosen, Miss Harper," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Chosen for this, to see again." Fiona hesitated, her mind racing. This wasn't just a shop. It was something else. Something older, darker, and the air was thick with it, pressing against her skin like the weight of 1,000 whispered secrets. But she reached for the box anyway, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a pair of glasses. They weren't ordinary glasses. They were antique, crafted with care, the lenses gleaming like pools of liquid silver. She could sense their weight, both physical and symbolic, before even touching them. "What are these?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They're your gift," the man said softly, his gaze never leaving her. "Put them on, and you will see what you are meant to see, what you are meant to find." Fiona's hand shook as she reached for the glasses, her pulse quickening, her breath shallow. She had lived in darkness for so long, had longed for this moment so desperately that she could taste it. She didn't hesitate. And when she slid the glasses onto her face, it felt as though a veil had been lifted. Fiona's breath caught in her throat as the world exploded into clarity. It wasn't the sudden shock of light, nor the sharp edges of color that took her by surprise. No, what rattled her was the sharpness of it all. She'd forgotten, of course, what the world looked like, but the difference between the memories of her sight and what she saw now was staggering. Every single object was bathed in detail. Each line and corner was defined with razor precision. It was like stepping out of a fog, but into something darker, something more alive. The shop around her seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The shelves, the dusty books, the small knickknacks, they weren't just objects anymore. They were things, alive in a way she hadn't noticed before. She could see every crack in the wood, every bent edge of paper. There were too many details, so many that she felt her mind start to whirl. Too much to process, too fast. But the strange part was, she didn't feel the warmth she expected from it. The shop should have felt cozy, like the warmth of an old room you're invited into after a long absence, a place that welcomes you home. Instead, the light felt wrong, as though it was not coming from a natural source. It was too harsh, almost like the glare of a spotlight trained on her. And the shadows were moving. They were subtle at first, just a flicker at the edges of her vision, a distortion in the corner of the room. But as she tried to focus on them, they shifted. The shadows seemed to fold in on themselves, stretching out like dark tendrils that reached toward her, testing the air around her. She blinked hard, but they didn't disappear. Instead, they lingered, curling and twisting as though they had a life of their own. "Are you seeing?" The man's voice cut through the haze of her confusion, sharp and disjointed. He was watching her closely, waiting for her response with an unsettling stillness in his gaze. Fiona's fingers trembled slightly, pressing against the velvet box. She had to be imagining things. The shadows, they were nothing, just trickery. Her mind adjusting to the sudden onslaught of light and detail. But the longer she stood there, the more the shadows moved. Her pulse quickened, the air in the room feeling thick, oppressive. She didn't trust herself to speak, but she nodded, the movement stiff, forced. "Yes, I can see. It's so clear." The man smiled again, that same unnerving, too perfect smile. There was something about it, something cold, like the sharp edge of a blade. "You're lucky," he said softly. "Very few are chosen." Fiona's head spun with the weight of his words. Chosen? She hadn't asked for this, hadn't begged for it. But the glasses, they had promised her a gift she couldn't refuse. And now, the world was opening up before her, offering up all its secrets, every detail laid bare. But there was something more beneath the surface, something she hadn't anticipated. The world didn't just look clearer, it felt heavier. She swallowed, trying to steady herself. I need to go. I need to see my daughter." The man didn't move, didn't speak, but his smile didn't falter. His presence seemed to fill the room, towering over her like a shadow of its own. "Of course," he said finally, his voice dropping low, as though the words were weighted with more meaning than she could understand. "But remember, what you see now isn't just a gift. It's a key." "A key?" Fiona echoed, her voice sounding thin in her own ears. He didn't answer directly, just nodded, as though he were confirming something she had yet to understand. Then, with a fluid motion, he turned, his long fingers reaching to collect the box from the counter. He slid it back beneath the surface, hidden from view. Fiona feeling a chill creep up her spine, stepped toward the door. The shop had grown even quieter, the heavy silence settling in her chest, making her heart beat too loudly in her ears. She could still feel the weight of his gaze on her as she reached for the door, her fingers brushing against the cool, familiar metal handle. She stepped outside. The sunlight hit her like a wave, flooding her vision with brightness. For a moment, Fiona felt like she was drowning in it, struggling to adjust. But when she finally squinted against the glare, the world she hadn't seen in so long seemed to jump at her. Colors erupted around her. Vibrant greens, bright blues, the orange of a woman's scarf fluttering in the wind. She could see everything. The sharp lines of the buildings, the cracked pavement beneath her feet, the sky stretching endlessly above. But it wasn't just the world around her that had returned. It was the way she felt it, everything. As she started walking toward her apartment, her cane no longer tapping in front of her, Fiona noticed something strange. A figure ahead of her, standing still, just beyond the edge of her peripheral vision. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a flicker of movement in the reflection of a store window. But when she turned her head to look, it was gone, nothing there. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the shift of her senses. She was no longer accustomed to seeing the world in such a way. It would take time to adjust, but the figure appeared again, this time standing under a street lamp at the edge of the park. It was a tall shape, its features indistinct, its presence unsettling in the way it remained still, unnaturally still, as if it were waiting for her to notice. And as she looked directly at it, she felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It watched her. Fiona's heart beat faster, and she turned away, quickening her pace. She didn't look back, but she could feel it, the eyes burning at the back of her head, waiting for her to turn and see more. The street seemed unnaturally quiet now, too still. The usual hum of life had disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence that made her ears ring. Her steps echoed off the pavement, too loud, too real. She reached her apartment building, but the sense of being watched didn't leave her. It was there, all around her, just out of reach, just beyond the corner of her vision. She didn't want to look, didn't want to know what she might see, and yet she couldn't help herself. She stepped inside, the door shutting behind her with a soft click. Fiona paused in the hallway, listening to the low, rhythmic thrum of her heartbeat, trying to calm herself. She had to focus. She had to see her daughter. But when she reached the kitchen, her daughter wasn't there. The house felt wrong. Quiet. Too quiet. And the shadows, those same shadows from the shop, the ones that had moved in the corner of her vision, were back. They stretched across the walls, reaching toward her, pulling the light away. The room grew darker, colder, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the window. Fiona blinked, and for the briefest moment, the shadows shifted. They moved like living things, like tendrils of smoke, and in that fleeting moment, she saw something else. In the reflection of the kitchen window, standing just behind her, was the figure. It was closer now. It was no longer just a shadow. It was staring at her, and this time, it was smiling. Fiona stood frozen in the kitchen, her heart hammering in her chest, as the figure in the reflection of the window stared back at her. She didn't dare move. The room was suddenly colder, the shadows more pronounced, as if the light itself had decided to leave her behind. The figure wasn't just standing there anymore. It was leaning toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it didn't belong in this world at all. Fiona could feel her skin prickling with the wrongness of it, a sensation that clawed at the back of her mind. It was as if her very perception of reality had begun to twist, unraveling around her like threads of a long-forgotten tapestry. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure's smile widened, stretching unnaturally, too wide to be human. It was more than a smile. It was a grotesque, inhuman grin, one that seemed to be mocking her very existence. The face in the reflection was nothing like the person she'd imagined, nothing like what she had expected from the world she was finally able to see again. Fiona slowly turned, the movement mechanical, almost against her will. The reflection disappeared, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. The room around her was normal once again, bathed in the soft, gentle light of the afternoon. But her mind refused to accept it. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the dread, the growing realization that something was terribly wrong. She reached out to steady herself against the kitchen counter, but her hands shook violently. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the counter as if it could anchor her to reality. But the feeling of unease lingered. The figure had been real. She hadn't imagined it. It had been there, and it had been watching her. Fiona shook her head, trying to steady her thoughts. She couldn't be going mad. She had to be imagining things. The glasses, the gift, everything was happening so fast, so unreal. But the longer she stood there, the more certain she became. The glasses hadn't just given her sight. They had opened her eyes to something else, to a world she wasn't meant to see. And the shadows, those shadows, weren't just shadows at all. They were something more, something far darker. The sound of a door opening from down the hallway broke through her thoughts, and Fiona felt herself jump. Her pulse quickened as she turned toward the sound, her breath shallow. It was her daughter. It had to be. She pushed through the kitchen door and into the living room, hoping to find some semblance of normality, to escape the growing dread clawing at her chest. Her daughter's voice was low, but Fiona could just make out the words. "Mama." Fiona's heart gave a painful jolt at the sound. She turned to see her daughter standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at her. The girl's face was framed by the light from the hallway, her features soft and familiar. For a brief, fleeting moment, Fiona allowed herself to believe that the horrors she'd felt, the shadows, the figure, the strange distortion of reality, had been a trick of her mind. She had been so desperate to see again, to feel whole, that maybe she had made herself see things that weren't there. Her daughter's voice drifted down the hallway again, and Fiona's feet were already moving before she could stop herself. "Mama, are you okay? You look strange." The words felt like a slap. Her daughter's face was so innocent, so unaware of the creeping terror that had wrapped itself around Fiona's mind. She smiled, tried to smile, though it felt like a grimace. "I'm fine, honey. Just a little tired." She didn't let herself dwell on the unease in her daughter's voice, didn't allow herself to look too closely at the way the shadows in the hallway seemed to ripple just out of her vision. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, when she looked up toward her daughter's room, she froze. There, just beyond the frame of the doorway, the figure stood again. It was too clear now, too defined, as if it were no longer confined to the reflection. It was standing in the shadows, but Fiona could see it clearly. A tall, unnaturally thin figure, its face a distorted mask of mockery. The smile. It was always the smile. Wide, too wide. And its eyes, those eyes, were dark pools of nothing, an abyss that swallowed all the light around it. Fiona's legs trembled beneath her. She had to run. She had to. Mom! Her daughter's voice cracked through her panic, but Fiona couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its body stretching toward her like a shadow made flesh, its limbs too long, too unnaturally twisted to belong in the world of the living. And in that moment, Fiona understood. The thing wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real. It had crossed the boundary between what she could see and what she shouldn't be able to see. And it was coming for her. Before Fiona could even react, the figure reached out, its hand, claw-like, cold, grabbing her arm with terrifying force. She gasped, but no sound escaped her lips. The grip was so tight, it was like it was squeezing the breath right out of her, its coldness seeping into her skin, traveling up her arm, up into her chest. The world snapped. Everything around her began to bend, the walls warping and shifting as if the house itself had come alive, pressing in on her from all sides. Fiona's mind screamed, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, but the figure only smiled, that hideous, mocking smile. And as it dragged her closer, Fiona's vision began to blur again, but not the way it used to. This wasn't the fog of blindness. No, this was different. It was as if the world itself was unraveling, distorting, tearing apart at the seams. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it all stopped. Fiona stumbled back, her head spinning, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figure was gone. The room had returned to its familiar shape. Her daughter, stood at the top of the stairs, watching her with concern, but there was nothing else. No figure, no shadows. It was as if nothing had happened at all, but Fiona could feel it. She could feel the darkness pressing against her, wrapping itself around her like a vice. She could still feel the touch of that cold hand on her arm, the weight of its presence, like a stain that would never wash away. She wanted to cry out, to ask her daughter if she had seen what she saw, if she had felt the chill in the air, but her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she turned and fled, not daring to look back. And when she shut the door behind her, sealing herself in her bedroom, she saw them again, the shadows. They were waiting. They were never far. And the glasses, those cursed glasses, had opened her eyes to a reality she could never escape. The shadows were waiting. Fiona knew this deep in her bones. She didn't need to see them, didn't need to hear the soft creaking of floorboards that no one else could possibly hear. Remember, she could feel them, pressing in on her from every direction, like a presence, a weight that clung to her skin, like soot she couldn't wash away. The glasses, she thought, her mind racing, her thoughts unspooling like thread from an unraveling spool. The glasses had done this. They had opened her eyes to something far worse than the world of light and color. She had wanted to see again so badly, but now that she could, now that the world had been revealed, she felt more blind than ever. Fiona couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The figure standing in the shadows, grinning that grin that never seemed to end. The eyes, those black eyes, that seemed to swallow all light, leaving only emptiness in their wake. The cold touch of its fingers, the sensation that it was waiting for her to turn, waiting for her to look too closely. Her daughter's voice came from downstairs, distant, a faint murmur through the thin walls. Fiona didn't answer. She couldn't bring herself to speak, to pretend that everything was normal, that she was still the mother her daughter needed her to be. The house was quiet, too quiet. The familiar sounds of life, footsteps, the hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the TV, were all gone, replaced by suffocating silence. It was as though the house itself had been swallowed by the same darkness that clung to her. The windows in her room, once bright and comforting, now seemed to reflect nothing. The streetlights outside blinked in and out, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched like fingers across the floor. Fiona shuddered. She stood from the bed and moved toward the window. Outside, the world was still, unmoving, bathed in the unnatural orange glow of the streetlights. But the shadows, they were there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, watching, waiting. She reached for the blinds, pulling them open, her hands trembling. She wanted to see it, to see the world outside, to feel like she still belonged to it. But as she looked out, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing at the end of the street, was the figure. It was no longer hidden in the corners of her vision, no longer a fleeting shadow in the corner of a room, or a flicker in the reflection of a window. No, this figure was standing there, in full view, its silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the dark street. The grin, the eyes. Fiona pressed her hand against the cold glass, her fingers shaking. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. She felt it then, the familiar sensation crawling under her skin. The sensation that something, someone, was watching her, but not in the way anyone should. No, this was something else, something far darker. The glasses had done this. They had pulled her into a world that wasn't meant to be seen, a world where the shadows had lives of their own, where the line between what was real and what was not had been irreversibly blurred, and that thing, that figure standing in the street, was a part of it. Fiona tore her eyes away from the window, her chest tight. She couldn't look, not again. She couldn't let it draw her in, couldn't let it claim her. But when she turned toward the door, the shadows in the corners of her room shifted. No longer content with their passive existence, they reached out, long, grasping fingers that snaked across the walls and the floor, twitching with malicious intent. Fiona froze, her breath catching in her throat. She heard a faint sound, a scraping noise, coming from behind her. Her head snapped toward it, her heart pounding. The shadows had formed a shape, a figure, smaller but unmistakable, the outline of a child. She gasped, stumbling backward. The figure in the hallway, a little girl, her face hidden in shadow, stepped forward, a dark, twisted reflection of her own daughter. The smile on its face was wide, so wide that it distorted the child's features beyond recognition. No. Fiona's pulse thundered in her ears. The glasses, the gift, had shown her something far worse than she could have imagined. It had opened a door, and something had slipped through, something that didn't belong, something that wanted to claim her, to drag her into the darkness that had already begun to unravel her reality. Fiona staggered backward, clutching her chest. The cold was seeping into her bones, the air too thick to breathe. She reached for the door, But the shadows, those shadows, moved faster than her mind could process. They swarmed around her, closing in like a living thing. The girl's smile, that twisted, unnatural grin, was the last thing she saw before everything went to black. When Fiona opened her eyes again, the room was dark. She gasped, sitting up too quickly, her head spinning. She was in her own bed, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, everything was quiet, normal. She breathed a sigh of relief. It had been a dream, just a dream. But when she looked around the room, the air seemed wrong. Something was off. The shadows in the corners of the room, they weren't still. They were moving, shifting, stretching. They seemed to pulse as though they were alive. No, they were more than just shadows. They were a presence, something far darker than anything she had ever imagined. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, willing them to disappear. She could feel their eyes on her, the cold, mocking touch of their gaze, like 1,000 icy needles piercing her skin. She could still hear her daughter's voice downstairs, but it sounded faint, distorted, as though it were coming from a distance she couldn't quite reach. Her hands were trembling, her chest tight with panic. And then the soft creak of a floorboard broke the silence. The figure was standing in her doorway. It was there, just beyond the threshold. The same twisted silhouette, the same grin stretched wide across its face. Fiona's breath caught, and she tried to scream, but no sound came. Her voice was gone. The figure stepped forward, its body jerking unnaturally, its limbs too long, too thin. It was grinning. It was always grinning. And the worst part? It was smiling at her daughter. Fiona was frozen. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway, the shadowy figure looming just outside, its unnatural grin stretching wider, as if pleased to find her standing there, helpless. The room seemed to warp around her. The air felt thick, as though every breath she took was a struggle against something that was pushing her back, holding her in place. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, still as a stone, its form barely human, barely alive, the edges of its outline bleeding into the shadows, as though it were a part of the darkness itself. It didn't need to make a sound. Its presence filled the room with a weight she couldn't explain. And then it smiled. The grin stretched impossibly wide, far too large for any human face, its edges curling upward like some grotesque parody of joy. The eyes, those hollow eyes, burned into her with an intensity that stole her breath. They were black holes absorbing everything, her fear, her horror, her soul. Fiona's chest tightened. She reached for her throat, trying to force air into her lungs. But the more she tried, the harder it became to breathe. The figure moved. No, shifted, its body twitching in ways that made her stomach twist in disbelief. It didn't walk, it glided, its limbs jerking unnaturally, each movement more unsettling than the last. And then, just like that, it was standing right in front of her. It had crossed the threshold. No more distance, no more safety. It was here. Fiona tried to step back, but her legs were made of lead, her feet frozen to the floor. The figure's smile never wavered. It didn't need to speak. It didn't need to do anything other than exist. And in that existence, it was a presence too dark, too wrong to be real. The glass lenses pressed against her skin, heavier now, as if they were trying to push into her very eyes, into her very mind. It was as if the glasses were not just a window to see the world, but a door to something else, something that had been watching her for far longer than she could comprehend. And now it was here. Fiona's heart raced, thudding in her chest, each beat like a drum of dread. She tried again to scream, but her throat felt sealed, as though something had reached into her chest and squeezed the sound out of her. She could only stare at the figure, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. Then it reached out. Its hand, a hand too large, too long, with fingers that curved like claws, came toward her, slow and deliberate. Fiona's body jerked in panic, but she couldn't move, couldn't escape. The fingers were too close, the coldness too palpable, and the air felt suddenly like ice, creeping into her very bones. It wasn't just a hand, not just an appendage reaching for her. It was the very embodiment of everything she had feared, everything she had felt stirring in the corners of her vision. The fingertips brushed against her cheek, icy cold, sending a shiver of ice up her spine. It wasn't just a touch, it was a claiming, a marking. The presence seeped into her skin, pulling her deeper, deeper into the shadow's cold embrace. And then it spoke. The voice was low, too soft to hear, but Fiona could feel it, an echo that resonated inside her skull, as though it were not a sound at all, but a thought, a command. She could hear it, feel it, twisting her mind. The words were unclear, foreign, too garbled to make sense, but the feeling behind them was unmistakable. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a warning, it was a promise. You belong to us now. Her body surged with terror, her pulse surging. Her vision flickered like an old, broken film reel. One moment, she saw the thing before her, its dark form so close that its grin threatened to consume her entire world. The next, she saw her daughter standing in the doorway, watching her with wide eyes, lips trembling in fear. The room twisted again, the shadows pulling tighter around her, clawing at her, suffocating her. But it was the glass, the glasses, that were the problem now, weren't they? They weren't just showing her the world, they were altering it, distorting reality itself, making things that shouldn't be real appear in front of her. And now, they were showing her something far worse than she could have ever imagined. Her daughter, her precious child, was still standing there, staring at her with an expression of horror. But it wasn't the daughter she knew. Number, the figure standing in the doorway, was a twisted reflection of her, a sick parody, her features warped and contorted into something unrecognizable. The eyes were empty, hollow, like the same dark void that filled the figure in front of her. And the mouth, the smile stretched wide, impossibly wide, as the child smiled back at her with that same unnatural grin. Fiona's chest seized with panic. She wanted to cry out. She wanted to reach for her, to pull her into her arms and protect her. But she couldn't. The shadow in front of her, the figure, had already begun to consume the space between them. The cold was unbearable now, like the very air was turning to frost, cutting her skin, freezing her in place. Fiona's thoughts spun, scrambled, trying to find any way to escape, to break free from the suffocating grip of the glass, the darkness, the figures. But she could feel herself slipping, could feel her vision fading once again, the world around her blurring in and out of focus. And then she realized it was too late. The figures, the shadows, the cold, it was too far gone. She had crossed the line. The glasses hadn't opened her eyes to the truth. They had ripped open a door to another world, a world where reality was no more than a thin veneer over a much darker truth, and now the darkness had come for her. Fiona felt her legs give out beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, her body numb, her mind unraveling with the realization that she was no longer in control. The world, her world, was gone. The figure in front of her was smiling, watching, waiting. And then Fiona heard it. The voice. Don't look away. She didn't want to. She knew she shouldn't. But she did. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. And when she opened them again, the world was gone. It wasn't the first time he'd visited a small town. In fact, it was becoming a bit of a habit. William Moore had an affinity for places like this. Quiet, out of the way, where you could catch your breath and think in ways the city never let you. He was a wanderer, a drifter by nature. No family to keep him anchored, no ties to bind him to any place. The wide open roads had been his home for as long as he could remember, stretching out ahead of him like an endless possibility. This village, though, it was different. There was a heaviness to it, a kind of strange energy that buzzed beneath the surface. The wind had been picking up as he walked into the small farming town of Rivermore, the golden leaves swirling around him in lacy, swirling patterns. He was used to the smell of harvest, earthy, sweet, and almost too sharp. But there was something about the air here that made it feel wrong. It was as if the land had been waiting for him. The town was quiet, too quiet. The buildings were all older, the kind that looked like they belonged to another era, their wood darkened by time and weather. The streets were narrow, lined with crooked fences and low stone walls, giving the impression that the whole place had been abandoned by the modern world. As he passed a small grocery store, a bell chimed. William turned instinctively to see an elderly man standing behind the counter, his pale face shadowed by a gray, unkempt beard. The man eyed William, his gaze sharp and unblinking, like he could see straight into William's soul. For a moment, they held each other's stare. "Fresh out of town?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, as though he'd been chewing on a rock for decades. "Yeah, just passing through," William answered, his smile awkward, unsure of the man's tone. "I'm looking for a place to stay for a night or two." The man grunted, not offering any warmth. "There's a bed and breakfast on the edge of town. Miss Corinne runs it. She'll take you in, but..." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You best make sure you're here for the right reasons, boy. This ain't the kind of town where people like you usually come." William blinked, taken aback by the hostility in the man's voice. He nodded anyway, unsure of what to say. "Right reasons. Got it. Thanks." The old man's eyes seemed to soften, just slightly. "The harvest's coming," he muttered. "You might want to watch your step. Things aren't always what they seem around here." Before William could respond, the bell jingled again, and the man turned back to his shelves, shuffling away as though the conversation was over. The last thing William saw was the old man's back, hunched and stiff, a figure that seemed to fade into the shadows of the store like a ghost. Rivermore didn't seem to be a place built for tourists. The houses sat close together, their gardens neat but uninviting, the yards dotted with pumpkins and withering cornstalks. The whole town had the feel of a place frozen in time, a place where everyone knew everyone else, and no one ever left. As he walked further into the heart of town, William couldn't help but notice the strange quietness. There were no children playing in the streets, no dogs barking, no voices carrying from open windows. Only the sound of his own footsteps breaking the silence. The few people he passed didn't make eye contact. They didn't even acknowledge his presence. It was unsettling. His pace slowed when he saw the town square up ahead, a small park with a statue of a man in the center. The statue was old, weather-worn, but what struck William was the figure's eyes, carved deep into the stone. They were wide and unblinking, fixed on some unseen thing. The square was empty, save for a small group of men standing off to the side, talking in hushed voices. They looked up as William approached, their conversation stopping abruptly. He didn't recognize any of them, but they knew he was a stranger. Their eyes shifted quickly, sizing him up, assessing whether or not he was someone they should bother with. He nodded to them and continued toward the B&B. When William arrived, he found Miss Corinne sitting on the porch, rocking in a chair with a crochet blanket draped across her lap. Her hair was long, silver, and braided down her back, and her eyes, pale blue and intense, immediately locked on him as he approached. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, a small but knowing smile curling her lips. "No, ma'am," William replied, tipping his hat slightly. "Just passing through. I'm looking for a room for the night." She considered him for a moment, then stood up, smoothing her dress. "You're welcome to stay, but be warned. This town has a way of pulling people in. Folks who stay too long sometimes forget they were ever strangers in the first place. Don't let that happen to you." The warning hung in the air, but William just smiled politely. "I'll be fine," he said, not thinking too much about her words. After all, every small town had its eccentricities. She led him inside, and he settled in quickly, appreciating the simplicity and comfort of the room. The bed was soft, the air warm, and the quiet was almost suffocating. By evening, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long, angular shadows across the fields that stretched beyond the edge of town. The golden light filtered through the trees in sharp beams, giving the landscape an otherworldly glow. William stepped outside to take in the view, pulling in a deep breath of the cool, crisp air. He noticed then that the town square was alive with activity. People in dark clothes were gathering, walking toward the statue he had seen earlier. The men from the park earlier were among them, along with families, all heading in the same direction, murmuring to each other in low tones. A strange sense of unease crawled up William's spine. He couldn't resist. He walked toward the square, trying to stay hidden in the long shadows, wanting to see what was going on. He was careful to stay out of sight, though part of him, some small, cautious part, urged him to turn around and go back to his room. As he neared the group, he saw them gather around the base of the statue. It was there, under the amber light of the street lamps, that they began to chant. Low, unintelligible words that sounded like nothing he'd ever heard. Their eyes were fixed on the statue, but there was something else in the way they moved, something almost ritualistic. One of the men stepped forward, carrying a large, rusted knife. He raised it high above his head, his eyes fixed on the statue with reverence. William's stomach churned. He had a sudden, gnawing feeling that he was witnessing something he wasn't supposed to. But before he could pull back, the man with the knife shouted something, and the crowd reacted in unison, their voices rising in a strange, hypnotic chant. Then, a figure stepped from behind the statue, someone in a long, dark cloak, its face hidden by a hood. That was when the real horror began. William's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure in the dark cloak step into the center of the circle. The crowd fell silent, their heads tilted as if in reverence, eyes fixed on the shadowed form that now held their attention completely. For a long moment, nothing moved, the air thick with anticipation, tension crackling like static. The figure in the cloak raised its hands, and the silence stretched, suffocating, until the man with the rusted knife stepped forward, bowing low before the hooded figure. William, still hidden in the shadows, barely dared to breathe, watching with a mix of curiosity and growing dread. The hooded figure nodded once, a sharp, deliberate motion. Then it spoke, its voice low, resonant, and unsettling, like the rasp of a man who hadn't spoken in years, a whisper that felt like a command. "Let the harvest begin." The words hung in the air, vibrating with an authority that made William's skin crawl. Before he could process what he was seeing, the man with the knife moved again, kneeling before the statue of the figure that stood at the center of the square. His hands trembled as he raised the blade, but his voice was steady, calling out the same chant the others had been murmuring before. "By soil, by root, by harvest, we claim." The crowd repeated the words in eerie unison, their voices now a low hum that blended with the wind. William's heart pounded in his chest, his instinct screaming at him to turn away, to run. But he couldn't. His feet felt like they were nailed to the earth, drawn to the strange ceremony unfolding in front of him, as though some dark, invisible force was keeping him rooted in place. The man with the knife moved swiftly, slashing the blade through the air. William's stomach twisted with nausea when he saw what he was doing, marking the statue with a jagged cut across its stone chest, the line of blood-red liquid dripping down from it, staining the stone like some unspeakable sacrifice. The crowd gasped in awe, some even falling to their knees as if in prayer. The energy in the square shifted, growing more intense, as if the earth itself was reacting to the ritual. A low hum began to rise from the ground, vibrating in William's bones. It felt wrong. The very air around him seemed to thicken, and he could almost taste the fear, a bitter, metallic flavor that clung to his tongue. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But his legs were locked in place, and his eyes were fixed on the scene, unable to look away. The cloaked figure raised its hands once more, and the ground beneath William's feet trembled. It was subtle at first, but then the earth shifted in a strange, unnatural way, as if something below the surface was moving, stirring to life. The people in the square didn't seem to notice. Their eyes were fixed on the cloaked figure, their faces rapt with devotion. Their chant grew louder, more fervent, as if they were offering themselves to some great power, and the sound was filling William's head, pounding against his skull. He staggered backward, pressing a hand to his temple, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. It was as if the words themselves were burrowing into his mind, clawing their way into his very thoughts. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air, a sharp raw sound that sliced through the chant like a knife. William snapped his head toward the source, his heart racing. A young woman stood at the edge of the crowd, her body shaking, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands were raised to her face, as though she were trying to protect herself from something unseen. Her mouth opened in a scream, but the sound was distorted, as though she were choking on the words. The crowd paid her no mind, continuing their chant, their voices now so loud that it felt like the entire town square was vibrating with their collective energy. The cloaked figure watched silently, unmoving, as the woman's scream grew louder, more desperate. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the woman collapsed to the ground, her body limp and lifeless. William's stomach twisted violently. He wanted to rush to her, to help her, but something held him back, something deeper than fear. The crowd around him didn't even flinch. They just continued to chant, as if the woman's fall was an expected part of the ritual. The man with the knife stepped forward again, his face grim. He didn't even look at the woman's body as he raised the blade once more, his voice growing stronger, more commanding. By blood, by earth, we give what is owed. The crowd repeated the words in a hushed, reverent tone. The air was thick with anticipation. William's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The words, the ritual, the energy, it was all too much. He was drowning in it. And then, as if responding to the words of the chant, the earth beneath the statue began to crack. At first, it was a small, harmless fracture, barely noticeable. But then slowly, the crack spread outward, splitting the stone beneath the cloaked figure's feet. The crowd gasped in awe, some of them stepping back, but others remained still, their eyes glued to the growing fissure in the earth. William's pulse quickened. His instincts were screaming at him now, louder than ever. The cloaked figure stepped forward, its dark robes sweeping across the ground as it approached the crack in the earth. Without a word, it knelt down, its fingers brushing the ground as if searching for something. Then, with a grunt of effort, the figure wrenched something free. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, like 1,000 voices whispering from beneath the earth. The ground trembled again, this time violently, as the figure held something up in its hands, a dark, glistening object that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The object was a bone, a long, twisted bone, dark as night, with strange markings etched into its surface. William's eyes widened in horror as the cloaked figure raised the bone high above its head, its voice rising in a chant of its own, words that no mortal tongue should ever speak. The crowd responded, their chant growing louder, swelling with intensity, as if they were summoning something old, something dark. William's legs finally gave out beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the chanting anymore. But then the ground split wide open, and from the depths of the earth, something began to rise. The ground cracked wide open with a sound like thunder, though there was no storm. The earth heaved and groaned, as if it had grown tired of being still, tired of being ignored, its very bones rattling in protest. William could feel the vibrations through his chest, a low rhythmic thud that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He lay there, his limbs stiff, his breath shallow, as if the earth itself was trying to drag him down with it into the blackened depths. The crowd, however, did not move. They stood in perfect stillness, their eyes glazed over, their faces empty of any emotion except the kind of devotion that made William's blood run cold. The woman's body, still lifeless on the ground, was forgotten now, an afterthought in the wake of whatever was emerging from the chasm in the earth. The cloaked figure held the bone high above its head, the markings on it glowing faintly, pulsing with a sickly light. Its voice, when it spoke again, was not a whisper, but a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very air. "Come forth," it intoned, the words ancient and filled with power. "Claim your due." And then, from the depths of the earth, something stirred. William watched, his mouth dry, his body trembling in a way he couldn't control. Something dark and twisted began to rise from the chasm, a shape shifting in the shadows, impossibly large, impossibly ancient. It was not a human form. No, not even close, but something more primal, more raw, as if it had been there long before men had ever walked the earth. Something that was part shadow, part nightmare, a creature born from the earth's deepest fears. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were vast and black, endless voids that seemed to draw the very light into them. Its skin was slick, like wet leather, and its limbs were long, grotesque things that curled and twisted with unnatural grace. The crowd began to chant again, their voices rising in a kind of feverish ecstasy. But William couldn't hear them anymore. Not clearly, at least. The sound of the creature's arrival, its presence, filled his ears like a wave crashing on the shore, drowning out everything else. A shrill, inhuman scream echoed from deep within the earth as the creature fully emerged, its massive form unfurling from the fissure like a bloated, twisted flower. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that glinted in the dim light, as if they were made of the same black stone that had split the ground apart. William's stomach churned, his mind unable to fully process what he was seeing. This was no ordinary ritual. This was no harvest. This was something far worse. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, as it pulled itself from the chasm. It was unnervingly graceful for something so monstrous, and William couldn't tear his eyes away. Its limbs, long and spindly, with joints that bent in the wrong directions, scraped against the stone and dirt as it pulled itself out of the earth, a grotesque symphony of sound that made his teeth ache. The crowd had fallen silent now, as if they were in the presence of something so ancient, so terrifying, that words had no meaning. The only sound that filled the square was the quiet rustling of the wind, the soft shuffle of feet as the people adjusted themselves. And then, as if on cue, the creature's head snapped to the side, its vast, hollow eyes locking onto William's hiding place. William's blood ran cold. He didn't know how it had seen him, how it could even know he was there, but somehow it had. The creature tilted its head, its eyes narrowing in a way that made his skin prickle with a coldness that seeped into his bones. A sharp, unsettling noise echoed from the thing's throat, like a deep growl mixed with the sound of gravel grinding beneath a boot. It took a step forward, its foot, if you could call it that, pressing down into the earth with a sickening crack, as though the ground itself was rejecting it. The chanting had started again. The people in the crowd swayed, their eyes fixed on the creature, as if they were entranced, caught in some hypnotic trance. Their voices were growing louder, reverberating off the buildings, a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to feed the very air with power. William, his heart hammering in his chest, slowly started to back away, his mind screaming at him to move, to get out. But the creature's eyes never left him. It was as if it was aware of him, aware of the trespasser who had dared to witness the sacred, ancient ritual. Another step. The earth trembled, and then the thing moved. In a blur of motion, faster than he could react, the creature lunged toward him, its long limbs stretching impossibly far. William barely had time to react before he was yanked from his feet, his body thrown backward into the dirt. The wind knocked from his lungs. A pair of cold, dead eyes stared down at him, empty voids that seemed to swallow everything in their gaze. He could feel its breath, hot, foul, on his face, and he could taste the decay of ages in the air around him. The stench was suffocating, a mixture of rot and earth, like something long dead rising from the grave. The creature's mouth opened wide, its teeth glinting in the dim light as it loomed over him. William's body trembled uncontrollably. He could feel the earth beneath him vibrate with the power of the thing standing over him, the very ground alive with its presence. And then, to his horror, it spoke. Its voice wasn't a language he could understand, but the sound itself, low, vibrating, felt like it was being carved into his skull, into his very soul. The creature reached down, its long fingers brushing against William's chest. The coldness of its touch sent a shock of fear through him, as if his very life force were being siphoned away. It lifted him, holding him suspended in the air, with an ease that was unnatural. William's body spasmed, his limbs jerking as if something were pulling him apart from the inside. The pain was indescribable, something more than physical, something deeper, darker. The chanting continued, louder now, a wall of sound that pressed in on William, threatening to crush him under its weight. And in that moment, he understood. The harvest wasn't for crops. It wasn't for the land. It was for them, for the creature and its dark masters. The people of Rivermore had been feeding the earth for centuries, sacrificing not just strangers, but their own in a twisted ritual that bound them to this ancient evil. The harvest was their price for survival. But William wasn't meant to survive. The creature's mouth opened wider. It let out a sound, a shrill, echoing wail, and for a moment, William could have sworn he saw something in the distance, something dark, shifting in the shadows. Then, everything went black. The darkness was absolute. It swallowed him whole, leaving no room for thought, for breath, for life. William couldn't move, couldn't feel anything. The air around him was thick, dense, and pressing against his body, as if the very atmosphere itself were trying to suffocate him. He wanted to scream, but his mouth refused to open. His mind screamed for him, trying to break free of the suffocating grip of the blackness, but it was useless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, a sliver of light pierced the nothingness. It was faint, but it was enough. It was a glimpse of something, the tiniest pinprick of reality, and William found himself reaching toward it, desperate to escape the crushing void that held him in place. His body jerked awake with a gasp. His lungs suddenly flooded with air, as though he'd been drowning and had just broken the surface. He sat up too quickly, dizzy, his head spinning as his eyes struggled to adjust. The world around him was blurry at first, disjointed, fragmented, but it quickly began to clear. He was lying on the cold ground. His arms were scraped and bruised, dirt and blood coating his skin. His heart hammered in his chest, still beating wildly from whatever had happened. Whatever force had gripped him, had taken him. He could feel the cold earth beneath him, the bitter sting of the wind against his skin, and yet the air felt wrong. It wasn't just the wind, it was everything. The sound of the chanting had stopped. The low hum of voices that had filled the square was now a dead silence, an absence so profound it pressed against his eardrums. The square, too, seemed different, somehow emptier. The buildings loomed around him like tombstones, their windows dark, their walls cracked, as though time itself had taken a step backward. And the people? They were gone. William stood on shaky legs, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of the creature's touch. He wiped his face, his hands coming away smeared with dirt and something darker, something that smelled faintly of rot, of death. The air smelled of decay, the stench almost unbearable. He gagged, his stomach threatening to rebel as the bitter taste of fear filled his mouth. What had happened? He had been taken. He remembered the creature, the void-like eyes that seemed to devour everything in their path, and the way it had lifted him into the air, as though he were nothing more than a toy to be played with. He could still feel its grip around him, could still hear the bone-rattling growl vibrating in his chest. He had thought he was going to die. He had known he was going to die. But now he was still here, and something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Something had shifted. Something had changed. But the world around him hadn't. Where is everyone? He whispered, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The sound of his voice was swallowed up by the oppressive silence that hung over the village. His breath came in shallow gasps as his mind raced to catch up with the horror he had witnessed. He looked around, half expecting the cloaked figure, the creature, to appear from the shadows, to drag him back into the depths of the earth. But there was nothing except the quiet. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, and made his way toward the center of the square. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of life, anything that would explain the unnatural stillness. But all he saw were the empty streets, the abandoned stalls, the lifeless homes that seemed to loom over him like hollowed-out husks. The statue in the center of the square, the one he had seen before, the one that had seemed so alive with the ritual's power, was gone. The stone figure that had once stood so tall and proud was now a crumbled heap, broken in half as if something massive had struck it with the force of a hammer. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious. Hours? Days? It felt like an eternity. But everything was wrong. The village, Rivermore, was deserted, lifeless. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned. It was as if the entire town had been erased. But no, that wasn't it. As William stumbled through the square, he began to notice something else, something more disturbing. The crops, the fields, the ones he had seen before, so lush, so ripe for harvest. Now they were withered, shriveled up into nothingness. The rows of corn that had stood so tall were now brown and brittle, the stalks crumbling under his gaze. The pumpkins, which should have been ripe and heavy, were little more than blackened, decaying husks. He reached down and touched one of the dying plants, the brown dried leaves crumbling in his fingers. It felt like the whole world had died along with the crops. A loud thud broke the stillness. William froze, every muscle in his body locking in place. He turned his head toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, at the edge of the square, he saw something, or rather, someone. A figure stood at the far side of the square, its back turned to him. It was silhouetted against the dim, faded light of the sky, but William could see the shape clearly enough. It was tall, cloaked, and moving slowly toward him, its steps deliberate, its presence heavy. The very air seemed to ripple around it, as though the creature itself was distorting the reality around it. Not the creature, the cloaked figure, the one who had summoned it. William's breath hitched as the figure turned slowly, its head tilting to one side. He could feel its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them. It had come for him. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. And then, in the most unsettling voice William had ever heard, it spoke. "The harvest is not yet complete." The words echoed in the still air, hanging between them like a suffocating fog. The harvest is not yet complete. William felt them coil around his insides, squeezing tighter with every passing second. He had no idea what that meant, no idea what had been happening in this accursed village. But he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. The figure in front of him, the one who had summoned that creature, the one who had orchestrated all of this, took a step toward him, its movement deliberate, almost painfully slow. The cloak it wore seemed to absorb the light around it, swallowing up the few remaining slivers of daylight that struggled to break through the clouds above. The sky, once a pale blue, had taken on a sickly, grayish hue, and the air felt heavy, as if something was waiting, something dreadful to unfold. The figure's face remained obscured, hidden beneath the shadow of the cloak's deep hood. But there was something about its presence, something about the way it stood there in the silence, that made William's blood run cold. It didn't have to speak again for William to know that it wasn't here for a conversation. It was here to finish the ritual. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the horrible weight of fate bearing down on him. The earth beneath his feet trembled ever so slightly, as though responding to the figure's movements, as though it too was aware of what was about to transpire. A gust of wind stirred the dry, brittle leaves that littered the ground around him, a sound like 1,000 whispers, each one a warning. What is this?" William's voice broke through the silence, sounding foreign, weak, even to his own ears. The words seemed to disappear as soon as they left his mouth, swallowed by the endless blackness that stretched out before him. His heart pounded in his chest, and despite his best efforts to remain calm, the panic rose within him like a tidal wave, threatening to crash over him, to drown him in fear. The figure didn't answer, didn't move, just watched him with that suffocating presence. Its head tilted, and the shadows within the hood seemed to deepen, as if the figure itself was no longer a person at all, but something far darker, something far older. William's mind reeled, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing fit. Nothing made sense. "The harvest is not for the crops, is it?" William finally managed, his voice trembling now, but still strong enough to be heard. "It's for us. It's for the souls of everyone in this village, isn't it?" The figure's hand, long bony fingers, rose slowly from its side, and William's eyes instinctively followed the movement. It wasn't a simple gesture. There was power in it. The fingers twitched, flexed, and the earth seemed to groan in response. The ground beneath his feet rumbled ominously, and the world around him seemed to shimmer, to distort, as though the very fabric of reality itself was coming apart. "Yes," the figure's voice came at last, deep, gravelly, like the sound of earth grinding against stone. "The harvest is for the souls. The land must feed, the people must feed, and the cycle must continue." William's heart sank as the words sank into him. The villagers, All those innocent people, they were part of this twisted ritual. They had been feeding it for generations, all for the sake of survival, all for the harvest. The crops, the fields, the rituals, they weren't just about sustenance. They were about keeping the darkness at bay. They were about giving the earth and whatever ancient evil lurked beneath it what it wanted. His thoughts turned to the villagers he had met, the ones who had greeted him with that strange, vacant familiarity. He had seen their faces, so eager to please, so willing to participate in the harvest. They had been raised for this. They had no choice but to play their part, just as their ancestors had done before them. And now, it was his turn. "No," William whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, I won't let you." The words came out before he could stop them, but he meant them with every fiber of his being. He didn't know how he was going to stop this, how he could even hope to fight against the ancient force that had gripped the village for centuries. But he knew that he couldn't let it take him. He couldn't let it take any more souls. "You can't stop it," the figure said, its voice thick with dark amusement. "The ritual is older than you can fathom. It is woven into the very fabric of this land, this place. The harvest is the price of life. Without it, all will wither, all will die." The ground beneath him trembled again, more violently this time. William's legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the air around him seemed to thicken, to suffocate him. The earth itself was rejecting him, as if it knew he wasn't supposed to be here, as if it was punishing him for trying to intervene. But there was something else, something different. The air seemed to crackle with energy, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for him to make a choice. He had been brought here for a reason. There was no denying that. But what was the reason? Was he meant to be the next sacrifice? Was he the last piece needed to complete the harvest? Remember, he wouldn't become part of the ritual. He couldn't let that happen. He had to fight. With all the strength he had left, William pushed himself to his feet, his body shaking, his muscles sore from the strain, but his resolve unwavering. He took a step forward, then another, his eyes locked on the cloaked figure in front of him. The figure raised its hand once more, a gesture so commanding that the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath him. The earth split open once more, and from the depths of the chasm, that thing, the creature, began to rise again, its massive form looming over them, its black eyes fixed on William with an intensity that made him feel like he was about to be consumed. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth, its breath hot and foul as it bore down on him. But William didn't back away. He didn't run. He stepped forward, reaching into the folds of his jacket and pulling out the knife that had been in his pocket since he first arrived in Rivermore. It was small, practical, nothing special, but in his hand, it felt like the only thing standing between him and certain death. The creature roared, the ground shaking with the force of its voice. The villagers, those few who had remained hidden, began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes hollow, their faces pale as they looked at William with silent, unblinking stares. They, too, had been trapped in this nightmare for far too long. But now, he could feel it. Something had shifted. Something had broken. They were not just witnesses to the harvest. They were part of it, and they could still be saved. "Stop it," William cried out, his voice raw with desperation. Please, I'm not here to die. I won't be part of this." And in that moment, as the creature's monstrous claws reached toward him, something inside William snapped, a final desperate act of defiance. The ground quaked beneath him as the knife in his hand gleamed in the dim light, and he threw himself forward, straight into the heart of the ritual. With a scream, the world exploded into light, and everything went dark. There are places in the world where the air tastes different, where the shadows linger longer, and where the ground itself feels like it's hiding something. The woods of Ashford were just such a place, a stretch of dense trees and choking underbrush that had swallowed countless stories over the years, each one darker than the last. Stories of things that lived beneath the canopy, of strange lights flickering in the distance, and of people, good people, who had wandered in and never returned. The old mansion at the heart of the woods was no different. It had been abandoned for nearly a century, a decaying relic of a time long gone. But the stories persisted. Locals whispered of strange noises at night, of lights seen flickering in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. They said that those who ventured too far into the house at night never came back. But these were nothing more than stories, passed down through the years, like some twisted game of telephone. A group of friends had heard these stories for years, of course, but none of them ever truly believed in them. After all, who would? The mansion was just an old house, rotting away at the edges of the forest, hidden behind trees and tangled vines. How could something so ordinary be the source of so much fear? At least, that was the argument Lucas made. He was always the skeptic, the one to laugh off the strange rumors, to call out the ghost stories for what they were, fiction. His friends, though, had always been intrigued by the idea of the mansion, its brooding, looming presence, just waiting for someone to take the dare. This time, they had decided, would be different. It was Lucas, of course, who had suggested they go. "It's time to see for ourselves," he said, grinning as he packed his bag with flashlights and a couple of bottles of cheap whiskey. "Enough of this stupid legend. We'll get inside, wander around a bit, and then we'll leave. Nothing to it." His friends, Eric, a quiet, brooding guy who preferred books to people, and Alice, a headstrong woman with an appetite for adventure, had agreed without hesitation. The thrill of doing something forbidden, of testing the boundaries of a long-standing myth, was too great. They all wanted to prove that there was nothing to fear, nothing supernatural hiding in the dark corners of the house. Even after the sun dipped below the horizon and the air began to cool, there was still a sense of lightness between them. They joked and laughed as they trudged through the underbrush, making their way toward the mansion. It wasn't much to look at, just a crumbling old structure with faded, peeling paint and windows boarded up with planks of rotting wood. But it stood tall, towering over the forest, like some forgotten god, its presence imposing despite its decay. By the time they reached the front steps, the first cool gust of wind began to roll in, the trees groaning as if in warning. Still, they didn't hesitate. They mounted the broken steps and pushed open the creaking door, which seemed to protest the intrusion with a long, agonizing groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the kind that had settled over everything in the house like a shroud. The smell of mildew was overpowering, and the darkness was absolute. No one had bothered to leave a light on in this forsaken place, and the flashlight beams from their bags cut through the dark like a desperate attempt to stave off the suffocating weight of the silence. "This is it, huh?" Alice said, her voice low and a little shaky. Her flashlight bobbed up and down as she looked around. "Pretty unimpressive, if you ask me." Lucas smirked and flicked his flashlight beam toward the old grand staircase in the center of the room. "You know, I'm starting to think these stories are just a bunch of crap. I bet there's nothing scary about this place at all." "Sure," Eric said, his voice soft, almost absent. He had always been the quiet one in their group, the one who would read something dark and brooding while the others partied or played games. But now, as he stood there in the shadow of the old mansion, there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't as convinced as Lucas. "I don't know," Eric said slowly. "There's something about this place, like it doesn't want us here." "Just nerves," Lucas said with a laugh, pushing forward. "Don't be such a buzzkill. We'll explore a little, take some pictures, then we'll head back." They made their way through the entryway, stepping cautiously over broken furniture, their flashlights dancing over the walls as they passed. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere grew, the air thick with a palpable sense of wrongness. But it wasn't enough to stop them. They were here to prove a point, after all. The hallways stretched out before them like an endless labyrinth of decay. The walls seemed to close in around them, the old wood groaning under the weight of time. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it didn't want them here. "Hey, check this out," Alice called, her voice echoing through the empty house. She had stumbled upon something strange, a narrow corridor at the back of the house. The air here was cooler, and the hallway was lit by the flickering light of a single candle, sitting on an old wooden table at the far end. It was the only light in the entire mansion. "That's odd," Lucas muttered, stepping forward with curiosity. "How is that candle still burning? There's no way anyone's been here for years. That thing should have gone out long ago." Eric said nothing, but stepped up beside Alice, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but he didn't say anything. The others didn't notice. "Let's just blow it out and get out of here," Alice said, her voice suddenly much quieter, as if she realized how eerie it was that the candle was still burning in such a place. Before anyone could respond, she leaned over, blowing on the candle's flame, extinguishing it with one breath. At that moment, everything changed. The world around them seemed to shift, the walls contracting as if they were closing in on them. The floor beneath their feet felt unstable, shifting beneath them like the earth itself was being rearranged. The air grew heavy, thick, and suffocating, as though something ancient was awakening. Then there were the whispers, low, barely audible at first, but growing louder, as though they were coming from everywhere at once. The whispers were soft, unintelligible at first, like a language forgotten by time. But then they began to form words, and those words chilled them to their core. Follow the candle, or be lost. The sound of breath caught in Lucas's throat as the shadows seemed to stretch, crawling toward them from the corners of the hallway. He could feel something, some force, pressing in on them, pushing them toward the darkness at the end of the hall. And the walls, they were moving. "Guys," Lucas whispered, his voice tight with fear, "we need to go." But the whispers continued, curling around their thoughts, wrapping their minds in fear. And though they wanted to turn, to run, there was a pull, something urging them forward, deeper into the mansion. The candle was still there, in the center of the hallway, beckoning them. It was their only choice. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent. They had no idea what they had just unleashed, but it was too late to turn back. The air in the hallway felt thick, almost gelatinous, as if it was pressing against their skin, crawling underneath their clothes. The weight of it was unbearable. The dark corners of the room seemed to deepen, stretching into shadows that twisted unnaturally, as if the mansion itself was reaching for them. The flickering candle, still burning on that weathered wooden table, cast elongated, monstrous shadows that crawled up the walls and down the floor, reaching toward them like grasping hands. Lucas blinked, trying to shake off the dizziness that threatened to pull him under. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but the air itself felt charged, humming with something unspeakable. His heart was pounding in his chest, the sound of his own breath ragged in his ears. He turned to the others, his throat dry, and found their faces just as pale as his own. "Are you hearing this?" Eric asked, his voice tight, his eyes wide as he looked around. The deep-set fear in his tone sent a chill down Lucas's spine. Alice didn't respond at first. She was staring at the candle, her face drawn, lips pressed together in a thin, tight line. She looked entranced, almost as though she couldn't look away from the flame, as though it held her in its thrall. "I don't like this," she finally muttered, her voice barely a whisper, like she was afraid to break the eerie stillness of the room. Her breath hitched as she took a step back, but something made her pause, her gaze flicking to the walls that seemed to be closing in on them. "Is the house shifting?" Lucas asked, swallowing hard. He felt lightheaded, as though his senses were starting to betray him. It was an unsettling thought, one that made his chest tighten in panic, but he couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister at play here. The mansion hadn't just been abandoned. Something was here. He could feel it in his bones. "Whatever it is," Eric whispered, voice trembling, "it doesn't want us here." There was a long moment of silence. The house seemed to hold its breath too. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and though Lucas had heard stories about haunted places before, he never imagined they would feel so alive, so oppressive. His breath came out in a steady cloud, the cold air stinging his skin. He stepped forward, his feet moving as though they were sinking into the floor with each step. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body kept moving, propelled by some strange force he couldn't understand. It was as though the house was pushing him, urging him to move toward the candle, toward whatever waited in the dark corridor ahead. The others were following behind him, though slowly, hesitantly. Lucas could hear their breathing now, shallow and fast, matching his own panic. He tried to call out to them, to tell them to stop, to turn back, but the words stuck in his throat. "Lucas, stop." Alice's voice was urgent now, strained. He turned to look at her, his eyes wide, but before he could speak, she was already taking a step toward him, her hand outstretched as if to grab him. But when she reached out, she paused. Her hand hovered above his arm, a thin sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. "I feel it," she whispered, voice trembling. "I feel like something's watching us, from all around." "Stop talking like that," Lucas said, his voice low, his words clipped. He hated how weak they sounded, but he couldn't stop the tremor that had taken hold of his hands. "There's nothing here but dust and decay. Just the house and our stupid curiosity." "I don't think that's true," Alice murmured, but she didn't pull away. She just stared at him, her eyes wide, haunted. She was seeing something he couldn't. Before Lucas could respond, the house groaned again, a low, deep sound that resonated through the walls, as if the structure itself were alive, stretching and shifting in its very bones. The floor beneath them creaked, a heavy, mournful sound. And then the whispers returned. This time they were louder, clearer. They were everywhere, from behind the walls, from above, from below. They seemed to curl into the very fabric of the air, snaking through the room like 1,000 voices, speaking in hushed tones. The words were familiar, like a memory that didn't belong, but the more they heard, the more the meaning began to seep into their minds. Follow the candle, follow the path. The whisper swirled in Lucas's mind, around his skull like a cage, tightening the walls of his sanity. He shook his head violently, trying to break free from the grip of it, but the words clung to him, crawling under his skin. Is this really happening?" Eric's voice cracked. He sounded smaller than Lucas had ever heard him before. The usually stoic, reserved Eric, the one who never let anything rattle him, was on the verge of losing it. "Get a hold of yourself," Lucas spat. Though he knew it was futile, they couldn't stop this. None of them could. They were already caught in the web. "Follow the candle," Alice repeated, her voice breathy, distant. She didn't sound like herself. "We have to follow it, or we'll—" The last word hung in the air, unfinished. "What?" Lucas demanded. He took another step forward, toward the flickering light that seemed to pulse in the center of the room like a living thing. He felt drawn to it, compelled to approach it, even though his mind screamed for him to turn back. "Follow the candle," Alice murmured again. Her voice was soft, almost reverent now. "It's the only way out." Lucas felt something shift in the pit of his stomach. Alice wasn't just afraid. She was entranced, drawn to the candle, as if it held the answer to everything. "No," he said, his voice hardening. "We're leaving. We're getting out of here right now." But Alice didn't move. Neither did Eric. They stood there, frozen, eyes fixed on the candle. It was as if the very fabric of their willpower was being torn apart, piece by piece, leaving them weak, malleable to whatever force was guiding them. "Alice! Eric!" Lucas shouted. He reached for Alice's arm, grabbing her roughly, but when his fingers touched her skin, it felt cold. Too cold. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide but hollow, like someone who was no longer present. "Not really. We can't leave," she said. "The house will take us. All of us." The words hit Lucas like a slap, and for a moment he was paralyzed. He couldn't understand. He didn't want to understand. He wanted to run. He needed to run. But the walls, they were getting closer. The hallway was shrinking around them. With every breath, the air became heavier, the shadows darker. The candlelight flickered again, casting strange, elongated shapes on the walls. And then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they fell silent. It was worse than the noise, because in the silence, Lucas could hear his heart pounding in his chest, his breath, the footsteps behind him, the house itself, breathing with them. The path was laid out before them, and the house would not let them leave. The silence stretched out around them, a thick blanket that smothered any attempt at rational thought. Lucas stood there, his hand still gripping Alice's arm, his breath shallow, a knot of terror lodged deep in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout, to snap out of whatever trance the house had cast over them. But he couldn't. It was as if something was holding his tongue, stopping him from calling out. It was the candle, he thought. The candle was the source of everything, the only thing that seemed to remain steady, glowing with an almost unnatural calm, despite the oppressive atmosphere surrounding them. He glanced back at Eric, who stood motionless, eyes fixed on the flame, his expression vacant. "Alice," Lucas said, his voice cracking as he shook her gently. "We need to go. Now this isn't us. We don't belong here." But she didn't respond. Her lips were parted, her breathing shallow, and her pupils dilated in a way that made Lucas's stomach turn. She was lost to the house, caught in its grip. She was already gone. Eric's voice broke through the fog of fear and confusion. "It's the candle, Lucas," he whispered. "We have to follow it. It's the only way. It's the only way out." The words felt like a punch to the gut, and Lucas recoiled, stepping back from Alice as if she had burned him. How had Eric become so complicit? Had he fallen under the same spell? The air around them felt electric, charged with some ancient energy, and the shadows, they were moving. Lucas couldn't stop himself. He turned his head toward the candle. There it sat, in the center of the narrow hallway, flickering in the dark like a beacon. The flame wavered, casting long, trembling shadows along the walls. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to make their next move. But there was no choice. Not really. The path before them was clear, but it was also a trap they had all willingly walked into. And the worst part? They couldn't leave without it, without the candle. Lucas's mouth went dry as he took a step forward, his feet feeling like lead, as though the floor was swallowing him with each movement. Alice and Eric remained still, but he could feel their eyes on him, even if they weren't looking at him. The weight of their gaze bore into him like an unbearable weight, and every part of him screamed to run, but he couldn't. The candle was pulling them in. "No," he whispered hoarsely, his breath coming in short gasps. "Number, this isn't real. This can't be real." But the house didn't care. The house was real. It always had been. Lucas took another step, then another, inching closer to the small, flickering flame. He had no idea why he was moving forward, only that there was a force compelling him to do so. Some invisible thread pulling him closer to the table that held the candle. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but the air was thick, suffocating, and all his thoughts seemed to get lost in the deep pit of dread that had opened up in his chest. He didn't even know how far they had walked, how many steps it took to reach the candle. Time had stopped making sense here. The shadows swelled around them, darkening, expanding as though they had a life of their own, whispering, curling like smoke at the edges of his thoughts. The flame flickered once more, casting a brief, unsettling glow on the walls, before it steadied, its light now more forceful, more certain. Lucas found himself standing before the table, staring down at the candle like it was the only thing left in the world. He reached out with trembling fingers, unable to stop himself. The moment his fingertips brushed the edge of the table, a cold shock ran through him, freezing him to the bone. "Follow the candle," Eric said again, this time with more urgency, more conviction. We have to follow it, or we'll be lost. Lucas turned, a sharp panic crawling under his skin. No, we can't. But before he could finish, the floor groaned beneath their feet. The entire house seemed to shudder with a deep, guttural noise, as if it were waking up, as if it had been lying dormant for years, and now it was stirring, stretching its limbs, preparing for something terrible. Then the whispering began again. Low at first, a barely audible hum that seemed to come from the walls, from the cracks in the floorboards, from the very air. But this time, there was no mistaking what they were saying. Take it. The voice was ancient, rough like gravel scraping against stone, but there was an undeniable urgency to it, a command that tugged at the core of Lucas's being. Take it. Follow the path. His fingers, stiff with cold, closed around the base of the candle. The moment his hand made contact, the room seemed to shift. The walls warped inward, breathing, bending as though they were alive. The shadows pulsed, and a new sound filled the air. A low, thrumming hum that resonated in Lucas's bones, in his very soul. He gripped the candle harder, his breath quickening. It was as if the house was wrapping itself around him, squeezing, urging him forward. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, emerging from the darkness. It wasn't a person, but something that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a mirage. A shape that wasn't quite human, but with the hollow sunken eyes of something that had been left behind for too long. Lucas felt his pulse thunder in his ears as the figure drew closer, a hollow, inhuman shape. It didn't speak, but he could feel it pulling him forward. The candle in his hand flickered, and the path stretched out before him, but his feet refused to move. Every inch of him was screaming to turn and run, to leave this place, to never look back. But the house had him now. The shadows crowded around him, thickening in the hallway, until the walls were nothing more than a blur of blackness. The candlelight trembled in his hand as he felt a cold presence beside him. He wasn't alone anymore. He never had been. You don't have a choice, a voice whispered in his ear, cold and sweet, a breath that was not human. Lucas wanted to scream, to drop the candle, but his fingers wouldn't obey him. They clung to the flame, each flicker a pull deeper into the house. The shape that hovered just beyond the edge of his vision seemed to grow taller, its presence more overwhelming. The whispers surrounded them now, all of them together, one single voice rising from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. Follow the candle. And in that moment, Lucas realized he wasn't in control anymore. The air was suffocating now, thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Every inch of the hallway seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though the walls were breathing, slow, deliberate inhales that made the very foundation of the house tremble. The candle in Lucas's hand flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows that crawled across the floor like fingers, grasping for him. He wanted to drop it, to run, but his fingers were frozen to the base, unwilling and unable to obey his frantic thoughts. He felt the presence beside him again, looming, towering. It wasn't a physical thing, at least not in the way a person was, but something far worse. A weight, a suffocating sense of wrongness that pressed against his chest and made it hard to breathe. It was no longer just the house that had him, but something far more malevolent, something that had waited for years, centuries perhaps, to sink its claws into anyone foolish enough to step inside. The shape was closer now, flickering like an old film, a silhouette caught between the world of the living and the dead. It had no face, only an empty hollow where features should be, like the void itself had taken human form. Lucas could feel it more than see it, its cold, shifting presence at the edge of his awareness, creeping, ever watching. "Keep moving," it seemed to whisper, but there were no words, only the slow, sinking pressure in his skull, the sensation of being pushed forward. The shadows around him grew deeper, darker, pulling him into the hallway, into the very walls themselves. Behind him, he heard Alice and Eric still breathing, still moving, though it was difficult to discern whether they were walking of their own volition or if they, too, had become part of the house's relentless current. He didn't dare turn to look at them. They were becoming just as much a part of the shadows as the house, just as lost to the curse. "Do you feel it?" Eric's voice broke through the thick air, his words low, almost reverent. The sound of them, heavy, thick, almost like they were part of the very house itself, made Lucas's stomach churn. Eric didn't sound afraid. He didn't even sound like Eric. "I feel it," Alice whispered from behind him. Her voice, once strong and certain, had become thin and fragile, like the air around them. "It's calling us." Lucas wanted to scream, wanted to lash out, to break free of whatever grip had taken hold of them. But he didn't, couldn't. He was moving, step by reluctant step, down the hallway, following the candle, watching as the shadows stretched further around him. It was as though his mind had become separate from his body, an observer locked in place, helpless to change the path before him. "Why can't we leave?" he muttered, the words escaping before he could stop them. The thought had been eating at him since they first stepped inside the house, but now it burned in his throat, desperate and hungry. Why couldn't they leave? A rasping laugh echoed from the walls, deep and guttural, a sound that didn't belong in any place made by human hands. Lucas froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He didn't have to look to know that the shape was closer now, its presence surrounding them, suffocating them. It was here, somewhere, in the hallway, with them. The laughter faded, and for a moment, the silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. "The house won't let you leave," the voice, cold and empty, whispered in Lucas's ear, so close now that he felt a chill run through him, freezing him to the bone. "The path is set. You cannot change what has already begun." Lucas's stomach twisted as the meaning of the words sank in. The house, no, it, wasn't just a building. It was a living thing, a thing that had chosen them, that had been waiting for them. All the stories, all the legends, they weren't just superstition or folklore. They were warnings, and they hadn't listened. "You're wrong," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking, his hands trembling as he tightened his grip on the candle. "We're not part of this. We're not part of you." But the whispering voice only grew louder, louder, until it filled his head, drowning out his own thoughts. "Yes, you are. You always have been." The house seemed to shudder around them, as though it had heard his defiance and now was punishing him for it. The walls of the hallway contracted, drawing them deeper, pulling them toward the next stretch of darkened corridor. It wasn't just the shadows closing in now, but something else, a sense of vertigo, a loss of time and space, as though the house was bending the very fabric of reality itself. They were moving down a path they could never return from. Lucas fought to hold on to his sanity as the walls seemed to pulse with the whispers, growing in volume, layering over each other in a maddening chorus of voices. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, louder than anything else, a steady drumbeat driving him forward. He tried to shut it out, to focus on anything else, but there was nothing left, no escape, no refuge. There was only the candle. In the flickering light, he saw the path ahead, an archway far off in the distance, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. The shadows seemed to bend and twist toward it, as though the walls themselves were guiding them, leading them toward whatever waited beyond. He felt it then, a presence even stronger than the one that had stalked them from the moment they entered. Something far worse, something ancient. No, he whispered, but the word had no weight. It was swallowed up by the house, by the shadows. The house didn't care about his resistance. It would have them. It would consume them. They had already crossed the point of no return. He didn't have to turn around to know that Alice and Eric were still following him, moving with a mindless, mechanical rhythm. Their footsteps echoed in the hallway, hollow and empty. Behind them, the shadows seemed to grow even darker, more solid, as though the house was taking shape around them, its form shifting and reshaping with each passing moment. The archway loomed closer, and as they neared, the temperature dropped further, the chill of the air biting into their skin. The house had never been warmer than an old, forgotten building, but now it was cold, a deep, soul-chilling cold that sank into the marrow of their bones. And then the voice, it, whispered again, the sound flowing through the walls, through their minds. You can never leave. And Lucas understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was already lost. All of them were. There was no running, no escape. The house had chosen them. The house would have them. And all they had to do was follow the candle. The archway was now only a few steps away, its light pulsating in rhythm with the throbbing pressure inside Lucas's skull. The whispers, low and guttural, echoed all around him, rising in pitch and volume with each step he took. His thoughts, once frantic and disjointed, were fading. Everything was slipping away. The room, the world, even himself. The candle burned with an intensity that almost felt like it was alive, its golden flame steady, unwavering, its light casting long, stretching shadows that danced like tendrils reaching for the darkness. The others were still behind him, silent, their presence like ghosts. Alice's breath had become faint, like a shallow wind through dry leaves, and Eric's footsteps no longer made a sound as he walked. The walls, once too close for comfort, now felt distant, their jagged lines blurring into the shadows. It was as if the house was pulling them toward the archway, toward the end of the hall, where there was no more light, only darkness. Lucas didn't know what awaited him beyond the arch, but he could feel it. It was pulling at his soul, like a slow, inevitable tide, drawing him into some unseen abyss. His heart thundered in his chest, the beat of it deafening in his ears. His feet felt lighter now, as though they were no longer touching the floor, as if he were floating, drifting toward the light. But it wasn't a light of salvation. No, this light was something else. The same cold, ancient power that had gripped them from the moment they stepped into the house. It was alive, and it was hungry. Stop, he heard Alice whisper behind him, though her voice barely rose above the eerie hum that filled the air. It was a desperate, pleading tone, but there was something else, something far more disturbing in her voice now. It was hollow, distant. It wasn't Alice anymore. Not truly. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The moment he let his eyes wander, the house would close in, and there would be no way out. "Don't listen to it," Lucas tried to say, but his voice was barely a rasp, barely audible over the rising whispers. The words, when they finally left his mouth, sounded almost wrong, like they were being forced through his throat by something outside of him, something controlling him. The archway was closer now, impossibly close. He was almost there, but something pulled at his feet, something invisible, tugging him back, as if the house didn't want him to go any further. The darkness within the archway seemed to stretch out, like a mouth opening wide, ready to consume him. It called to him, and for the briefest moment, Lucas could almost see what lay beyond. It wasn't another room, wasn't another hallway. It was nothing, a vast emptiness where time and space had no meaning, where even the shadows ceased to exist. The void that stretched beyond was more than just the absence of light. It was a place that should never have been touched by human eyes. The candle flickered violently, its flame threatening to gutter out, but Lucas's hand refused to release it. His fingers were numb, stiff, but still they held on, as though they were no longer his own, as if the candle had become part of him. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but it was as if his body had already made its choice for him. He was already a part of it. He had always been a part of it. A cold wave of realization hit him like a slap to the face, so sudden and overwhelming that he nearly stumbled, but he didn't dare look away from the arch. Not now. Not with whatever was waiting just beyond it. It wasn't just the house that had chosen them. It was the house itself. The house had been waiting for them, for someone, anyone, to step inside. It was hungry, as hungry as the shadows that swallowed everything in their path, and they were its sacrifice. "Eric?" Lucas's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Alice? Can you hear me?" No answer. No sound. Only the eerie hum, now louder, now filled with a hunger so sharp and consuming that it nearly tore through him. The house wasn't just a thing. It was a creature, an entity, a nightmare that had grown old and tired of waiting. It was alive, and it wanted them. The figures behind him shuffled forward, and he could feel the pressure of their presence like a weight at his back. But still, he couldn't bring himself to turn around. Something inside him warned him that the moment he did, the house would claim him entirely. It would drag him into the dark with the others, and he would never see daylight again. But the archway loomed before him, beckoning, promising release or something far worse. Whatever lay beyond, the candle's flame seemed to speak to him, urging him forward. He had no choice but to take the next step. He had already crossed the point of no return. The air grew colder still as he stepped closer to the arch, and a thick, sour smell filled the hallway, sharp and putrid, like something rotten was waiting to be uncovered. The floor beneath him creaked in protest, as though it too felt the pull of the house's dark hunger. He reached the arch, and beyond it, all was dark, a vast expanse of shadows, so dense that they seemed to suck the light away. And yet, the candle still burned, still held steady in his hand. But in that moment, it no longer felt like a simple object, a mere tool. The flame seemed to breathe, an entity of its own, and Lucas's grip tightened around it involuntarily. And then, just when he thought he couldn't bear another second of silence, there was a voice, Not in his ear, not in the shadows. No, this voice came from deep within him. It whispered his name, soft and insistent, like an old friend calling him home. Come closer. It was the house. It was calling him. And for the first time, Lucas understood with a sickening clarity what was happening. The house wasn't just pulling them in. It was welcoming them. It wanted them. It wanted them to be a part of it. And there was no way out. With a final dreadful push, he stepped forward, into the void, into the place where shadows lived and light had no meaning. The candle burned brightly for a moment, its light a last defiant flare against the encroaching darkness. And then, as the last flicker of light extinguished in his hand, Lucas vanished into the dark. It started like a whisper at first, a creeping shadow in the corner of his mind, soft but persistent. At first, Jasper thought it was nothing, a product of too many late-night horror movies or the leftover stress from school. But the dreams kept coming, and with each night, they grew worse. It was always the same. He would be standing in a field, tall grass swaying under a sky so gray it felt like the world was holding its breath. At first, he couldn't move. He'd try, but his legs felt rooted to the ground, heavy and unwilling. His heart would pound in his chest, a thudding drumbeat of pure terror. And when he finally managed to break free, he turned to see it. The thing. It was a shadow at first, indistinct, a mass of shifting, writhing darkness. But the more he stared at it, the clearer it became. It had form, shape, a towering figure, hunched with long, ragged limbs that reached toward him like claws. Its face was the worst part. No eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to suck the light from around it. And its mouth, if you could call it that, was an abyss. No lips, no teeth, just a dark void. And it would always chase him. It didn't run. It didn't need to. It moved slowly, but its presence was overwhelming. He'd run, stumbling through the field, his breath ragged in his chest, but it was always there, always behind him. Just when he thought he might escape, when the edge of the field was in sight, he'd feel the cold, suffocating grip on his throat and wake up, just before it reached him. It had been like that for weeks, but then the scratches started. At first, Jasper had brushed it off as a coincidence. Maybe his dog, Thor, had gotten a little too playful in the middle of the night. But it kept happening. Small, thin lines of red appearing on his arms, his chest, even his neck. Just the kind of marks you'd get from brushing against something sharp. But there was no explanation, no reason for them. He hadn't been near anything that could have caused them. Thor hadn't even been in his room in days. One morning, after a particularly awful dream where the thing had almost caught him, he woke up with a deep scratch running along his jawline. It looked fresh, still swollen and pink, but when he touched it, it felt cold, like it had been there for hours, maybe days. The skin around it was tight and sore, but the rest of him felt oddly numb, like he had been touched by something that wasn't quite real. But it didn't stop there. The following night, the shadows in his room grew thicker, and when he woke up, the feeling of dread didn't fade. His room was exactly as he had left it the night before, but something was wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an unnatural heaviness in the air, a tightness in his chest, as though the walls themselves were closing in around him. He got up, turned on his bedside lamp, and found his dresser had been moved, just a few inches, but enough to make the air feel wrong. The drawers were half open, and his clothes were scattered across the floor. Had he done that? Was he sleepwalking again? He couldn't remember, but the unease in his gut told him otherwise. For the next few days, the feeling only deepened. The scratches continued, more frequent now, as if something was slowly carving its mark into him. And each time he woke, his room seemed just a little bit more off. The floorboards creaked when they shouldn't, and the air was always a little too cold, no matter how high the thermostat was set. It was the whispering that finally pushed him to the edge. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling, like the sound of someone breathing just out of earshot. But by the end of the week, it had grown louder, more urgent. Sometimes it felt like it was coming from the walls, other times from the closet. Every night, the shadows grew more oppressive. The thing from his dreams, that towering, faceless horror, was beginning to seep into his waking world. Jasper couldn't take it anymore. Something was wrong. Something had crossed over from the dream world into his reality, and he didn't know how to stop it. That's when he heard about her. It was a quiet afternoon when he first overheard the conversation in the library. He had been thumbing through some books on old myths and folklore, trying to find some rational explanation for his nightmares. He was always the logical type, the kind of person who tried to find reason in things that were too irrational to explain. But nothing made sense. Not the dreams, not the scratches, not the way things were moving around in his room. But then, two older women were sitting in the corner, whispering, their voices low but full of urgency. Jasper wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the mention of the dream eater caught his attention. It wasn't a term he had ever heard before. The older woman, her hair thin and silver, spoke of it like it was a fact of life, something that could be controlled. The younger woman, who was clearly a local, nodded gravely, asking questions Jasper didn't fully understand. They spoke of it as though it were a thing that existed, something real and dangerous, a being that could be stopped, but only by someone with the right knowledge. The phrase dream eater stuck in Jasper's mind like a splinter, digging deeper the more he thought about it. It sounded too absurd to be true. Yet, the more he reflected on his own nightmares, the more the term seemed to fit. The thing in his dreams, the one that chased him, that wanted him, it wasn't just a monster. It was a predator, feeding on something. His fear, perhaps. His soul. He had to know more. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The shadows in his room felt darker, the walls closer. The thing, that monstrous presence, lingered just at the edge of his vision, waiting for him to close his eyes. When he woke up the next morning, there was a deep gash on his wrist, bleeding but oddly cold. It didn't look like anything he'd seen before. Not from his dog, not from any rough handling. This was something else. Desperation clawed at him. He had to find the woman they had spoken about. The woman who could stop the dreams. And he had to do it soon, because he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on before the dream eater took everything from him. Jasper's mind raced as he lay in bed that night. The shadows in his room felt like they were alive, pressing in on him. It wasn't just the weight of the darkness. It was the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to fall asleep, to let his guard down. His heart thudded relentlessly in his chest, and even though the room was as silent as a tomb, he could hear the whispering again, soft and distant, like the sound of a breeze through dead branches. His skin felt cold. Every small movement seemed to make the shadows shift, flicker. Was it his imagination, or was the thing from his dreams creeping closer into his waking world? The scratch on his wrist throbbed, the coldness of it settling deeper into his bones. He hadn't imagined that. It was too real. A reminder that whatever was happening wasn't just in his head. Jasper's thoughts snapped back to the conversation he'd overheard earlier that afternoon at the library. The Dream Eater. He couldn't get it out of his mind. The idea that a creature, or perhaps something worse, was slipping through the cracks between dreams and reality, feeding on his fear, his very essence. It was impossible to ignore. He had to find this woman, the one they'd spoken of, the one who could stop it. But how? How could he find someone who might hold the key to his salvation in a town full of people who spoke in hushed tones, as if saying the words aloud would summon something darker? Jasper stood up, dragging himself to the window. Outside, the moon hung low, casting long shadows across the lawn. The trees seemed to bend toward the house, whispering to each other in the wind. The chill in the air seeped through the glass, brushing against his skin like the fingers of the thing from his dreams. He shuddered, but he didn't move away. The whispering grew louder. A sudden sharp knock at the door startled him, and he spun around, heart hammering. Who could be knocking at this hour? Jasper? A voice called, muffled by the door. It was low, familiar, yet he couldn't place it. Jasper, I know you're awake. I know what you're hearing. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't told anyone about his dreams. His family thought he was simply stressed out. Too much homework, too little sleep. They had no idea about the shadows that followed him, or the cold scratches that marred his skin like messages from some unseen force. Jasper opened the door. He didn't want to. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He knew better than to let anything inside his room at night, especially when it was connected to whatever force was hunting him. But something about the voice was different. It was soothing, strangely comforting. It pulled him in like a moth to a flame. Against his better judgment, he stepped toward the door and reached for the handle. The second he opened it, the cold air from the outside rushed in, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and mildew, as though a storm had just passed through. There was no one there. He stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the empty hallway, half expecting someone to leap out at him from the shadows. His pulse raced, and the door slammed shut behind him of its own accord, as though it had been waiting to trap him in the dark. Jasper, the voice again. This time, it was coming from inside his head. It was hers, the woman, the one from the library. In the space of a heartbeat, the room seemed to distort. The edges of the walls blurred and twisted, and the very air felt thick and oppressive. A sudden weight pressed down on him, as though something had wrapped its hands around his chest. He staggered back, heart beating wildly. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. "I can help you," the voice continued. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a presence, an echo in the very marrow of his bones. "But you must listen. You must trust me." He shook his head, trying to push the voice out of his mind. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. Every instinct told him to flee, but it was as if something deeper had taken hold, something darker that bound him to the floor. "What do I do?" he thought desperately. "Who are you?" The voice answered with a soft chuckle. I am the one who can save you. But you have to come to me. You must come before it's too late." Jasper staggered to the chair in the corner of his room, dropping into it. His heart raced as his mind tried to make sense of what was happening. There was no one here, not physically, but the voice, her voice, was as real as anything else. He closed his eyes, wishing it would all stop, but the pressure in his chest didn't let up. In fact, it grew stronger, tighter, until he couldn't breathe, until his lungs burned. "Do not worry," the voice murmured. "You're not alone. I will show you the way." The pressure eased slightly, enough that he could fill his lungs again. But when he opened his eyes, the room had changed. The shadows in the corners of the room were deeper now, more alive. They shifted and twitched as though they had a mind of their own, slithering along the walls. The candlelight from the night before, long since extinguished, flickered in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows across the floor. They seemed to beckon to him, urging him to follow, to move toward the darkness. But something in him screamed, "No, I can't go back there. I can't." The shadows, though, weren't waiting for him to decide. They began to move, to crawl toward him, slowly, like fingers reaching out from the void. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure in the room lifted. Jasper blinked, and the room returned to normal. The shadows were back to being shadows. The air felt lighter. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it all, but his heart still pounded, and the voice, her voice, echoed in his mind, persistent and unrelenting. "You are running out of time." Jasper scrambled to his feet, his mind spinning. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. Was he losing his grip on reality? Was the thing from his dreams truly real? And what about the woman? Was she real? Or was she part of whatever nightmare was eating away at him? He didn't have the answers, but he had a feeling he wouldn't be able to keep running forever. Not from the thing, not from her. The Dream Eater was coming, and it wanted more than just his fear. Jasper didn't sleep much that night. How could he, after what had happened? After hearing her voice so clearly in his head, after feeling the weight of the shadows pressing in on him like they were alive, he lay awake in bed, the darkness around him thick, suffocating, but somehow less oppressive than it had been earlier. The absence of the voice, the strange pull in the air, made it feel like the room was holding its breath, waiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The voice had promised to help him, but how could he trust it? Could he trust her? Whoever she was, wherever she was. Or was it all some sick trick, a game the thing in his dreams was playing with him, drawing him deeper into a nightmare that never ended? Jasper clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. His skin was crawling with a mix of fear and confusion. Was he losing his mind? Was the world slipping away from him piece by piece? The longer he sat there in the oppressive silence of his room, the more the unease inside him grew. The scratches, the whispers, the constant feeling of being watched, they were all getting worse. Was he becoming the thing in his dreams? Or was the Dream Eater slowly eating away at him, piece by piece, until nothing of him was left? Then just before the dawn, when the gray light of early morning was filtering through his blinds, Jasper heard it again, a soft rapping at his window. At first, he thought he was imagining it, or maybe it was just the wind pushing against the glass. But no, it came again. 3 knocks, deliberate, slow. a rhythmic pattern that sent a jolt of icy fear running through his veins. He shot up from his bed, heart hammering, and approached the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he peered out into the yard, but all he saw were the silhouettes of the trees swaying in the wind. There was no one there, no one in sight. Nothing but the creeping gray light of the morning stretching across the field. But the knocking continued. Each rap of the knuckles was like a needle puncturing his skin. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside his head, a sharp, insistent sound that beat in time with the growing panic in his chest. "Jasper," the voice came again, the woman's voice, clear and soothing, as though it had never left. "You must come. It's time." Time for what? He shook his head, heart pounding. Why was it always calling to him? Oh, why couldn't it leave him alone? "Come to me," the voice coaxed, now a little more urgent. "You know where to find me. You know what must be done." That's when he saw it. On the floor, by the foot of his bed, something flickered in the darkness. A pale light. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the shadows themselves. But it was there, unmistakable now, flickering like a tiny flame, soft and steady. It was a candle, the same candle that had burned on the table in his dream. Jasper's stomach churned. His thoughts spun into a cyclone of dread. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, to pull him in like tendrils of smoke. The candle, it was real. It was burning right there in his room. But how? He moved toward it, almost against his will, driven by the same compulsion that had kept him frozen in place earlier. His feet felt like they were moving through molasses, slow and heavy, but the pull of the flame was irresistible. The closer he got to it, the more he felt as though the shadows were closing in around him. The candlelight danced, casting strange, flickering patterns on the walls, shapes that seemed to shift, morph, and twist like living things. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the candle. The moment his fingers closed around the wax, the world around him seemed to snap back into focus. The shadows retreated, the air lightened, but only for a moment, and then it all went wrong. The room shook violently, and a low guttural sound rumbled through the floorboards beneath him. A deep, resonant growl. Something was coming. Jasper's heart raced. He didn't even think to question it anymore. He dropped the candle and bolted for the door. But before he could reach it, the floor beneath him cracked open like the earth itself had split apart. He stumbled backward, his hands shooting out to catch himself, but there was no ground beneath him. Nothing. He was falling. For what felt like an eternity, he plummeted through darkness. The air was thick and cold, and the sounds around him were distorted, like a million whispers all at once. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the abyss. His chest burned, and his lungs ached as though the very weight of the air was crushing him. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. He crashed to the floor, hard. The air knocked out of him as he landed on a cold stone surface. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But when he opened his eyes, everything was different. He wasn't in his room anymore. He wasn't even in his house. He was in a vast underground cavern, its walls slick with moisture and veins of dark stone. The air smelled of earth, of decay, of something ancient and long forgotten. And in the center of the cavern, on a pedestal of black stone, stood a figure. It was her, the woman, She was no longer the kindly voice he'd heard in his mind, no longer the old woman from the library. No, now she was something far darker. Her eyes were pitch black, endless voids, and her smile was wide, too wide, unnaturally so. Her face was pale, stretched tight over her skull, and there, hanging from her outstretched hand, was a candle, the same candle. Jasper's stomach lurched. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. He couldn't run. He couldn't escape. The ground beneath him was cold, unforgiving, and as he forced himself to sit up, he realized he wasn't alone. The shadows had gathered. They were watching him. "You came," she said softly, her voice both familiar and terrifying, like an echo from the depths of his darkest dreams. "Now, you must stay." Jasper's body shook violently as he tried to push himself up from the cold stone floor, his limbs stiff and uncooperative. The woman, no, the thing, stood over him, her eyes gleaming black in the dim, sickly light of the cavern. Her lips curled upward in that unnaturally wide smile that sent a pulse of pure terror through him. The shadows gathered around her like living things, swirling at her feet, their edges sharp, their forms hard to discern, as though the darkness itself were alive and sentient. The cavern was alive too. Every breath Jasper took felt heavier, laden with the thick stench of mildew and damp earth. The walls seemed to pulse like a heartbeat echoing in his chest. The sound reverberated through his bones, shaking him to the core, as though the very place itself wanted to consume him. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" The woman's voice was soft, almost kind, but there was a sinister undertone that sent a chill skittering down his spine. No one escapes the dreams. Not really. Not forever. Jasper swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, as though he hadn't spoken in days. Every inch of him screamed to get away from her, to run, to find an exit, any exit. But the cavern stretched on, an endless sea of darkness that offered no comfort. The shadows closed in, tightening around him like a vice. They were everywhere, whispering, clawing at the edges of his sanity. What was this place? He tried to remember how he'd gotten here. Had he fallen through the floor of his room? Had he woken up? This felt like a dream, but it was too real. It couldn't be. The cold stone beneath him, the dampness in the air, the way his body ached from the fall. It hurt. This was no dream. "No," he said, his voice rough, barely a whisper. "This isn't real. You're not real." She chuckled, a sound that was smooth and cold as it slid through the dark. "Oh, but I am. And you're just starting to understand that. This is where all the dreams come to die, Jasper. This is where we feed." He stumbled backward, pushing himself up against the stone wall. His legs were weak, his mind a jumble of confusion and fear. The shadows had begun to move again, swarming like a fog. He could hear their whispers now, low and guttural, like voices calling from some faraway place. No matter which direction he turned, they seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "You'd think I'm here to help you." The woman's voice rang out, louder now, almost mocking. "You think I'm your savior?" Jasper's heart stuttered in his chest, the words landing like blows. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He couldn't accept the truth of it. Not yet. But deep down, he knew. He knew the Dream Eater had never been on his side. "I am not here to save you," the woman continued, her form shifting, the shadows around her moving like tendrils, curling and reaching. "I am here to feed." Jasper's breath hitched in his throat. His mind flashed to the dreams. The endless chases, the darkness, the heavy presence that lurked just out of sight. The thing that had chased him through the labyrinth of his nightmares wasn't trying to hurt him. Number It had been trying to feed on him all along. Suddenly, the shadows lunged forward. Jasper screamed, stumbling backward, but there was no room to run. They closed in around him, wrapping around his legs, tightening their hold like 1,000 invisible hands. He could feel their icy fingers brush against his skin, feel them pulling at him, dragging him forward toward the woman, toward the pedestal where the candle still burned, flickering in the stale air. "You don't get to run away, Jasper," she purred, her voice warm, seductive. The shadows churned like a living thing beneath her feet. "You belong to the Dream Eater now, and we don't let go." Jasper felt his chest tighten, his heart threatening to burst from the pressure. He had to escape. He had to get away from her, from the shadows that coiled around him like snakes. He didn't know what was worse, the suffocating grip of the darkness or the way the woman's eyes saw him, deep into his soul, as though she were reading his every thought, his every fear. She knew him. She knew what he was terrified of. "No," he gasped. "You're lying. You're not real. You're just a figment of your nightmares." She finished for him, a sharp, cruel smile twisting her lips. "Oh, Jasper, I wish that were true, but I am as real as the darkness in your heart, as real as the shadows that come to feed on you when the night falls." Her laughter echoed through the cavern, a sound that seemed to shake the very air. The walls trembled, the shadows writhed, and the ground beneath him began to quake. Jasper forced himself to his feet, eyes darting frantically around the cavern. There had to be a way out, a way to break free, but the more he looked, the more the shadows closed in on him. They were everywhere, pressing in from every direction, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. He was suffocating in the noise, in the presence of the thing that had been haunting him for so long. He looked back at the woman, her figure bathed in a sickly light, and he saw it then, the candle, the same one from his dreams. The flame flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the cavern walls. It was alive too, pulsing with a rhythm all its own, and it was calling to him. "No," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I won't." But the shadows were closing in, and he could feel them, could feel the weight of their cold fingers wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the flame. "You have no choice, Jasper," the woman said softly. "You belong to the Dream Eater now, and there's no waking from this." Her voice, the shadows, the darkness, it all came crashing down on him at once. The world twisted, and the floor beneath him seemed to collapse again, opening up into a bottomless abyss. He could hear the whispers again. They were coming for him, but this time there was no escaping. This time, the Dream Eater would consume him whole. Jasper's heart thundered in his chest as the shadows closed in tighter, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The woman's smile was a razor-sharp grin, her dark eyes gleaming with hunger, like a predator waiting for the moment to strike. He could feel the weight of the shadows pressing against him, suffocating him, pulling him into the abyss that was growing wider by the second. The ground beneath him trembled again, shaking violently, as though the very earth was being torn apart. The whispers swelled, becoming a cacophony of voices, 1,000 low, guttural sounds that mixed together like the rustling of leaves in a storm. It felt like the world was closing in on him from all sides, pushing him toward that flickering candle on the pedestal. The candle, the source of it all. Jasper's breath hitched. The more he stared at the flame, the more it pulled him in, like a moth drawn to a dangerous fire. It wasn't just the candle. It was the woman, the dream eater. She was the flame, and he was the moth. She took a slow step toward him, her footsteps soundless on the cold stone floor. "It's over now, Jasper," she purred, her voice like silk, smooth and cold. "There's nowhere left to run. You've already given yourself to me." Jasper's legs shook beneath him, and he struggled to keep himself upright, but his body felt like it was made of lead. He could feel the cold tendrils of darkness wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the flame, toward the woman. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. The cavern had become a trap, and he was caught in its jaws. "No," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I won't let you. You've already let me, Jasper." The woman's smile widened, if that was even possible. "The moment you dreamt of me, you gave me your soul. And now, it's time to feed." She reached out a hand toward him, her fingers long and clawed, like a spider preparing to wrap its prey in silk. Jasper tried to back away, but the shadows held him fast. They were everywhere now, binding him to the cold stone floor. His arms trembled as he tried to push them away, but they were relentless. He could feel their icy touch against his skin, seeping into his veins, stealing his strength, and then, as though he had no control over his body anymore, his legs moved, slowly at first, then faster and faster still, as though some invisible force was forcing him toward the flame, toward her. "No!" he cried out, but the words were swallowed by the crushing darkness around him. His vision blurred, his mind scrambled, but there was no escaping the pull, no escaping her. She was right there now, just inches away, her black eyes boring into his soul. "It's too late," she whispered. "There's no going back. You're mine, Jasper." And with that, she raised her hand and touched the candle's flame to his skin. The heat was unbearable. Jasper screamed, a high-pitched cry that echoed through the cavern, like the wail of a tortured animal. The flame scorched his skin, burning him from the inside out. It felt like his very soul was being consumed, like the fire was eating away at his flesh, devouring him piece by piece. But through the pain, through the flames, something inside him snapped. He wouldn't go down like this. The darkness may have been strong, but Jasper wasn't finished yet. He wasn't just going to let the Dream Eater take him without a fight. He dug deep beyond the fear, beyond the pain, and grasped for the one thing that had always kept him grounded, his will to survive. He reached for the shadows, not to fight them, but to use them. He focused on the cold, empty feeling in his chest, the hollow space that had opened up the moment he'd stepped into the cavern. The shadows were born of fear, but they also fed on it. And what was fear, if not something you could control? For the first time, Jasper understood how to manipulate them. With a desperate, primal roar, he tore the shadows from around him. The darkness writhed like a living thing, snapping back like a whip. But he held on, grabbing at the tendrils with every ounce of strength left in him. The shadows recoiled, twisted in his grasp like something wounded. For the first time, they obeyed him. The woman stepped back, her expression a mixture of confusion and rage. "No," she hissed. "You can't." But Jasper wasn't listening anymore. He didn't need to hear her words. He didn't need to understand her. He just needed to escape. With a final, forceful pull, he ripped the shadows from his body, casting them away into the void. The cavern screamed in protest, the walls trembling violently, but Jasper didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He hurled himself toward the candle, the source of all this terror, and grabbed it from the pedestal. The moment his fingers closed around the base, the cavern seemed to shudder, like the entire world was falling apart. The woman shrieked, a sound like nails on glass, as the shadows that had once obeyed her began to writhe and burn. She raised her hands to her face, as though trying to shield herself from something invisible. Her eyes locked on Jasper, and for the first time, there was fear in them. "You can't," she whispered, voice cracking. "You can't destroy me." But Jasper didn't listen. With one final, desperate push, he slammed the candle into the ground. The world exploded. The cavern shattered. The shadows dissolved into nothingness. The woman screamed one last time, an ear-splitting, blood-curdling scream, and then, just as quickly as it had all begun, everything went silent. The flame went out. Jasper blinked, disoriented, his chest heaving with effort. He was still standing in the ruins of the cavern, but the woman, the shadows, the overwhelming sense of darkness, they were all gone. There was nothing left but the cold stone beneath his feet and the echo of his own breath in the silence. He was free, but even as he stood there, in the remnants of that broken world, a nagging feeling began to creep back into his mind. It wasn't over. It couldn't be over. Jasper turned his head, scanning the vast emptiness of the cavern, looking for any sign of the Dream Eater's return. But there was nothing. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A flicker of light. A candle. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the whispers returned, soft and insistent, curling around the edges of his consciousness like smoke. They weren't done with him. Not yet. The house was beautiful. That was the first thing John noticed when he stepped out of the truck, stretching his back after the long drive. He'd heard rumors about the place, the kind of house you hear about in whispered conversations over beers at the corner bar. But now that he was standing in front of it, he couldn't deny the truth. It was everything they had dreamed of. Old, but not too old. Majestic, but not so big it felt like a mansion. It was a house that seemed to be waiting for them, with a history buried deep within its weathered walls, as if it had been expecting them all along. His wife, his pregnant wife, was already at the front door, fiddling with the keys. She was smiling, the kind of smile that could lift even the heaviest of hearts, the kind of smile that made him feel like the luckiest man alive. He watched her for a moment, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her round belly stretched tight under the fabric of her loose blouse. There was something so serene about her, so content, as if every piece of her life had finally fallen into place. "I can't believe it," she said, turning toward him with a spark in her eyes. "It feels like home already." He smiled back, although there was a slight tightening in his chest. It had been a hell of a year, a roller coaster really, but this house, it was supposed to be the beginning of something new. They had both agreed on that. "Yeah," he replied, trying to ignore the unsettling tug at the back of his mind. "It's perfect." The old house loomed behind them, a grand structure with faded yellow paint and a long porch that wrapped around its sides. The windows, large, but not too large, seemed to smile down at them, like old friends welcoming them in. The yard was a bit wild, untended, but that was fine. It had character, and that was what they were looking for. As they crossed the threshold, the smell hit him first. Dust and old wood, and something faintly sweet, almost like lavender. It was the smell of a house that had been empty for too long, a house waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. They wandered through the downstairs first, the kitchen and the dining room and the living room, each space somehow larger than it had looked in the photos, filled with creaky floorboards and sunlit corners. They could hear their footsteps echoing off the walls, the sound bouncing in the empty rooms, like a kind of welcome, a promise of what was to come. John turned to his wife. "What do you think of the kitchen?" She ran her hand along the counter, her eyes bright. "It's perfect. Just needs a little work, but nothing too bad." He nodded, though in truth, it was hard to focus on the kitchen. His mind kept drifting back to the upstairs, to the room that had been so carefully left out of their initial tour, the nursery, the one room they hadn't asked to see. It was odd now, looking back, how the realtor had danced around it, never directly pointing it out, but somehow making sure they knew it was there. Maybe it was the house itself that felt alive, humming softly like it was waiting for them. Maybe it was the way their footsteps had echoed through the empty halls, or the way the front door had creaked open so easily, like it had been expecting them to arrive. But even though the house was clearly filled with history, it wasn't until they ventured up the stairs that something else began to stir in him, something unfamiliar, something cold. "Where do you want to start upstairs?" his wife, Laura, asked, sensing his distraction. He didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the staircase, studying the way the banister curved up into the shadows. It was as if the house was drawing him toward it, urging him to go on, to explore further. "Let's check out the master bedroom first," he said finally, his voice thick with hesitation. She gave him an odd look, then shrugged. "Okay, but I'm more interested in that nursery. You know, for the baby." He could feel his stomach tighten at the mention of the room. There was something about it, something about the way it had been set aside, almost forgotten. The second floor of the house felt different, thicker somehow. The air was heavier, like it had been untouched for too long. It seemed to hold its breath as they walked down the narrow hall, passing a few small rooms. Nothing that stood out, nothing that drew his attention. But there it was, the last door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Laura was already ahead of him, her hand on the door. "This must be it," she said, peering inside. "I can already see the crib." He caught up to her just as she pushed the door open, and the room unfolded in front of them like a dream. It was pristine. The nursery was like something from a magazine, light-colored walls, a gentle shade of pale yellow with white trim. The crib sat in the center of the room, draped with a delicate wide canopy. A rocking chair nestled in one corner, beside a window that let in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. There was a bookshelf, stacked with children's books that looked as if they had never been touched, their edges sharp and unused. Even the air felt clean, fresh, like it had never been disturbed. But it was empty, perfectly empty. The odd part was how new everything seemed. The crib had no scratches. The rocking chair was untouched, and there wasn't a single speck of dust on the floor. This room had been prepared for a baby who had never come. A chill crawled up his spine as he looked around, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right here. He wanted to turn and leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He could see the way Laura was staring at the room too, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, as if she could feel it too. Something unspoken, something wrong. "Wow," she whispered. "It's beautiful." But it wasn't just beautiful, it was wrong. "Yeah," he said, trying to force a smile. "It's perfect." But it wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. The emptiness of the room hung in the air like a thick fog. They were both staring at the crib now, both silently wondering why such a room had been prepared with so much care, so much love, yet had been left behind, never used. There was something oppressive about it, something suffocating. The walls felt too close, the air too still, like it had been waiting for something to happen. "Maybe it was a mistake," Laura said after a long silence, shaking her head as if to dispel the odd tension hanging over them. "Maybe they just left it for some future owner." But John didn't believe that. Something about the way everything was arranged, the immaculate crib, the clean floor, the untouched toys, it didn't add up. It felt too perfect, too deliberate. This was no accident, but he couldn't say that. Not to her. Not now, when they were supposed to be starting a new life, ready to bring their own child into this home. A fresh start. "Yeah," he said, forcing the words out. "I'm sure that's it." They left the room together, the door clicking shut behind them. But the feeling lingered in the air like smoke, something impossible to shake, something unexplainable. The next few days in the house were filled with excitement and the usual chaos of moving in. Laura and John settled into the rhythm of unpacking boxes, setting up the nursery, though for reasons neither of them could quite place. They avoided the room in the far hallway, and cleaning. The house began to take on a new, warmer feeling. The echoes of emptiness faded as their laughter filled the rooms, as they imagined their life unfolding within these walls. But there was something unsettling about the nights. It started small, at first just a sound, a faint noise, barely there at all. John thought it was the house settling, the old beams shifting as the temperature dropped. He thought nothing of it, but then it came again, a soft, muffled sound, almost like a whimper or a cry. John had never been one to believe in ghosts or spirits. That was something he had always left to the conspiracy theorists and horror movie junkies. He scoffed at that sort of thing. But still, when the sound came again, clearer this time, it was harder to dismiss. It was coming from upstairs. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked one night as they sat together on the couch in the living room. The wind howled outside, a winter storm setting in, rattling the windows and pushing the trees against the house with an eerie creak. John looked at her, surprised. "I did." They both sat in silence for a moment, straining to hear over the storm. The cry came again, a faint, pitiful sound, like a baby in distress, desperate and alone. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves, as if the house was breathing with it. "It's nothing," John said, but his voice was tight. He stood up, stretching his legs. "Probably just the wind, some animal outside." Laura didn't look convinced. She was still staring at the ceiling, her face pale, her brow furrowed in confusion. "It sounded like a baby," she said quietly, almost to herself. John opened his mouth to say something, probably to reassure her, to tell her it was just her imagination. But then he heard it again, the sound. This time, it was louder, more distinct, a baby's cry. John froze. His heart seemed to skip a beat as the realization hit him. No, that's impossible, he muttered, shaking his head. It's not real. It's just the house. But even as he said it, he felt a twinge of doubt, something cold creeping up his spine. There was no way a baby could be in the house. They had only just moved in, and there was no one else here. I'm going to check it out, he said, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. He wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. He looked over at Laura. She was clutching the arm of the couch, her knuckles white. John, I'm scared, she whispered. It's not normal, is it? He didn't answer at first. He didn't know what to say. The house had always felt alive in a way that unsettled him. The creaks and groans of the old wood were almost too intentional, like they were in response to his every movement. And now this, the cry of a baby. It didn't make sense. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, his feet unmoving, feeling an unshakable dread crawl through his chest. The sound came again, so close now that it seemed to be right outside the door, or worse, right inside the walls. Swallowing hard, he moved toward the stairs, hearing each step beneath him echo in the silence. Laura was behind him now, her footsteps soft, hesitant. You don't have to come, John said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He wanted to say it was nothing, but somehow the words wouldn't come. Something was wrong. Laura, of course, didn't listen. She followed him up the stairs, both of them walking slowly, trying not to disturb the house, as if it might lash out at them in response, as if it was waiting for them. The upstairs was dim, the only light coming from a cracked window at the end of the hall. A breeze blew in, carrying the scent of wet leaves and damp wood. John's stomach twisted in knots. He paused at the door to the nursery, the room they had promised to avoid, the room that had been untouched, too pristine, too perfect. The door was still ajar, just slightly, as it had been before. Laura was standing behind him now, her breath coming in short gasps. Are we really doing this? She asked, her voice small. John hesitated, then pushed open the door. The room was exactly as they had left it. The crib stood untouched, the books still in perfect order, the rocking chair still in its corner. Everything about it seemed frozen in time, as if waiting for them to come back, to fill it with life. But the silence in the room was heavy, like it was holding its breath. See? Nothing, John said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. He moved into the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid of breaking something delicate. But then, just as he was about to turn back to Laura, he heard it, the cry. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from the corner of the room, from behind the rocking chair. The cry was softer now, like the sound of something or someone in deep pain. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, that made his skin crawl. Laura, he whispered, turning toward her. Her face had drained of color, her mouth barely moving. Did you hear that? She asked. The room seemed to be closing in on them, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The cry came again, louder now, but when John turned toward the corner, the chair was still empty. No baby, no anything. He felt his heart pound in his chest, like it was trying to claw its way out. "There's nothing here," he said, his voice strained, but the doubt was already gnawing at him. "We're just hearing things. It's the wind." But deep down, he knew it wasn't the wind. He knew the sound, and he knew it wasn't real. It wasn't supposed to be there. He turned quickly and walked back toward the door, his steps faster now, as if he could outrun the sensation that had been creeping into his bones. Laura followed him without a word, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Once they were downstairs again, John's breath was coming in sharp gasps. The house seemed to be watching them, listening to their every move. He could feel the walls pressing in around him, the weight of them. "John, ... Laura's voice was trembling now. What was that? He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to explain the feeling of dread that had settled over him like a heavy cloak. He wanted to reassure her, but there was nothing to say. "I don't know," he replied quietly, "but I don't think we should be here alone tonight." The night was long. The house settled, creaked, and groaned in ways it hadn't before, as if it were alive, waiting for something to happen. The baby's cry had stopped, for now, but the silence that followed was just as suffocating. John lay awake in bed beside Laura, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The nursery, the cry, the room that shouldn't have been there. But there was one thing he couldn't shake, the feeling that something had been waiting for them, waiting for her. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. The morning came too soon. John woke up with a cold sweat clinging to his skin, the events of the night still fresh in his mind. The cry, the feeling that something was just there, in the corners of the room, hiding behind the rocking chair. It had all felt so real, so alive, and yet, when he had searched the room, there had been nothing, absolutely nothing. He glanced at Laura beside him, still sleeping soundly, her body curled under the blanket as though none of it had ever happened. But he knew better. He knew it wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. The house, it was more than just a place. It was like it was waiting. "Morning," Laura said groggily, her voice thick with sleep as she stirred beside him. She blinked at him, the weariness in her eyes obvious, but even still, there was a gentle smile tugging at her lips, a smile that tried to reassure him. She was trying to reassure him, trying to act like nothing was wrong. He didn't want to tell her what he'd been feeling, how the silence in the house had gotten under his skin, how the corners of the room had seemed to shift in the dark. "Morning," he managed, though his voice sounded tight. He cleared his throat, sitting up and running a hand through his hair. "You sleep okay?" Laura stretched, sitting up with a yawn. "I slept like a rock, actually. Better than I thought I would after everything last night." She rubbed her belly absent-mindedly, smiling down at it. "I think the baby liked the house too." John didn't answer right away. He was too busy staring at the window, at the light streaming in through the thin curtains. The house was so quiet, so still. It almost felt like it was waiting for something to happen. "John?" Laura's voice pulled him out of his daze. "You're staring at that window like it's about to explode. What's going on? You're scaring me." He snapped his gaze back to her, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, just thinking about last night?" she asked, her voice soft. There was a knowing look in her eyes now, the kind of look she got when she knew he was holding something back. The baby's cry, right? He didn't answer, though the question was hanging in the air, waiting for a response. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it press on his chest. "I don't know," he said quietly, looking away. "I don't know what it was. I've never heard anything like that before." Laura sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe we're both just freaked out. The house is old, John. It creaks, it settles, and we're both under a lot of stress with the move and everything. And the baby, you know how it is. Maybe it's just our minds playing tricks." But John wasn't so sure. He didn't want to admit it, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left him since they moved in. It was like the house was aware of them, of their presence. It felt too alive, too aware of them. "You're probably right," he said, though the words sounded hollow, even to him. They spent the day trying to ignore the feeling. They unpacked more boxes, organizing kitchen cabinets, setting up their bedroom, and preparing for the arrival of their baby. But no matter how hard they tried to push it aside, the house had a way of creeping into their thoughts. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sent their nerves tingling with unease. When they finally finished with the downstairs, John decided to take a walk outside. He needed fresh air. He needed to clear his head. Laura agreed to stay inside for a while, working on organizing the nursery. John's steps were heavy as he walked around the yard, his hands in his pockets. The storm from last night had passed, but the sky still looked like it was holding its breath, a sickly gray haze hanging over everything. The house loomed behind him, its shadow stretching long across the yard. For a moment, John thought he saw something move in the window of the nursery, but when he turned around, the window was empty. He squinted, a weird chill creeping down his spine. There was no way anyone could be there. He shook it off, trying to focus on the fresh air, but the nagging feeling of being watched still clung to him. It was like the house itself was an entity, breathing alongside him, waiting. By the time he returned to the front door, Laura was standing in the living room, staring at a stack of old boxes. Her face was pale, her expression distant, as though she had been in a trance. "Hey, you okay?" John asked as he stepped inside, his voice soft. Laura didn't answer right away. She only glanced up at him, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly agape. Then, slowly, she lifted a small box from the pile and handed it to him. "I found this in the attic," she said, her voice barely a whisper. John's heart skipped a beat as he took the box from her hands. It was old, worn. The edges were frayed, the wood stained with age. There was no label on the box, no identifying marks, but there was something about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked back at Laura. "The attic?" She nodded. "Yeah. I didn't want to look inside at first, but then I thought, maybe it's something for the baby, a family heirloom or something." But she trailed off, her eyes going unfocused. "I don't know. I didn't feel right up there, John. It was cold, the air. And then I saw this." John slowly knelt down and opened the box. Inside, there were old, yellowed letters, neatly folded. At the bottom, something small and delicate. An old baby shoe. He picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather was cracked and worn, but it was clearly a child's shoe. But it was more than that. Something about the shoe. It felt wrong. His fingers brushed over the letters next, and as he unfolded one of them, his eye scanned the faded ink. The handwriting was careful, methodical, nothing too strange about it at first. But then the words began to form a sentence that made his blood run cold. "We wait for her. She will return." John felt his stomach lurch as he dropped the letter back into the box. The shoe tumbled out, landing on the floor with a soft thud. He stood up quickly, backing away from the box, as if it had just burned him. "John?" Laura's voice was trembling now, the concern in her eyes thickening with every passing second. "What's wrong?" I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what this is, but whatever it is, it's not good." Laura took a step closer, her hand reaching for his arm. "What do you mean? What does it say?" John hesitated, but then spoke the words aloud. "It says, 'We wait for her. She will return.'" A silence hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against them both. It wasn't just the words that terrified him. It was the realization that somehow, in some way, they were the ones being waited for. And it wasn't a welcoming. It wasn't a greeting. The house was waiting for them to bring her back. The baby. Later that night, as they lay in bed, the silence settled between them like an unwelcome guest. John had no answers, and every time he thought about the box in the attic, the letters, the shoe, the chilling message, he felt like he was sinking deeper into something wrong, something unnatural. The house was awake now, and it was hungry. The night stretched on with a suffocating heaviness, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for them to finally crack. Laura slept fitfully beside John, her body shifting in restless waves, but John couldn't close his eyes. His mind was too busy spinning with images of the box, the letters, and that haunting message, "She will return." A terrible thought crossed his mind in the dead of night. What if it was never meant for them? What if they were just intruders, filling a space that had already been claimed? His stomach twisted as the realization settled in. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it had been waiting for something far older than their arrival. Maybe it had been waiting for her, the baby, the one they had planned for, dreamed of, the one they were expecting. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't the first ones to answer its call. John shifted on the bed, sitting up slowly, his hand clutching the cool metal of the bedpost for balance. He looked at Laura again. She was sleeping, her face peaceful, unaware of the terror creeping through the house's walls. The clock on the nightstand read 2:32 a.m. He rubbed his face, trying to clear the fog from his mind. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to understand what was happening here, or else he might lose his grip on reality altogether. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in thought, before he heard it again. The faint sound, so quiet at first that it could almost be dismissed. But then it came again, a soft cry, like a baby calling out in the dark. John's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The sound was real. He couldn't ignore it any longer. John's hand trembled as he pulled the covers off and swung his legs to the floor. He stood up slowly, his bare feet sinking into the cold wood. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and he could feel the house groan around him. Laura stirred beside him, but didn't wake. He didn't dare shake her awake. She would be terrified. The house seemed darker now, even though there was enough moonlight streaming in through the window. Every shadow felt like it had form, like something was moving just out of his sight. He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to walk down the hallway toward the source of the sound, the nursery. It was just a room, right? It was just an empty, untouched nursery. There couldn't be anything there. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as he ascended them, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound of the baby crying grew louder the closer he got, until it was no longer just a cry. It was a wail, a long, pitiful sound, almost like a pleading. His heart began to race in his chest, the blood pounding in his ears. He reached the top of the stairs and stood for a moment, staring down the hallway. The door to the nursery was still slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light leaking from the crack. For a long time, he just stood there, trying to steady his breathing, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Get a grip, man," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, but his feet wouldn't move. The sound of the baby's wail seemed to cling to him, rooting him to the spot. Finally, he forced himself to step forward. Each step seemed louder than the last, until he found himself standing before the door. He reached out with a trembling hand, pushing the door open just a fraction more. The room was the same as it had been earlier that day. Pristine, untouched, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. But there was something different now. The crib stood there, empty, its white canopy fluttering slightly, as though a breeze had passed through. The rocking chair was in the same spot. The books on the shelf were lined up neatly, untouched. But the air was heavy with something unexplainable, something oppressive. The silence in the room was thick. And then, through the stillness, came the sound again. The baby's cry. It was coming from the rocking chair. John's breath caught in his throat. There was no baby there. There couldn't be. He had checked. And yet, the cry, loud, desperate, filled with sorrow, came from that very corner of the room where the chair was still. He stepped forward, slowly, unwilling to make a sound. His hand hovered near the chair. His heart pounded. He reached out and for the briefest moment wondered if his fingers would touch something cold, something alive. But the chair was empty, still as it had been the entire time. No baby, but the cry still echoed. His stomach twisted. His legs felt weak, as if the air itself were pressing down on him. "Laura," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to her or to the house itself. What the hell is going on? But there was no answer. Not from Laura, and certainly not from whatever waited in the shadows of the room. A sudden realization hit him, so sharp that it almost made him stumble. He hadn't checked the closet, in the corner, where the door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been open when they first moved in, but now it seemed to beckon him. A dark, quiet void that promised something hidden deep inside. He took a hesitant step forward, his body trembling. The baby's cry was still ringing in his ears, louder now, as if it were coming from inside him. The walls, the ceiling, everything seemed to hum with the sound. He reached out and pulled open the closet door. The dark space inside was empty, completely empty, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, stale, cold, like it hadn't been opened in years. His fingers brushed against the back wall, and that's when he felt it. There, tucked behind the closet wall, a narrow crack ran down the length of it, almost imperceptible, like someone had carefully concealed it. His pulse quickened. He pushed harder against the crack, and the wall gave way with a faint groan, as if it had been waiting for him to discover it. A hidden door. With shaking hands, he pulled it open, revealing what lay beyond. At first, there was nothing, just a narrow, musty passageway leading into the darkness. But then, in the distance, he saw it. A light flickered, dim and pale. John took a step forward, his heart thudding in his chest. The baby's cry had stopped, but something else had taken its place. A low, guttural sound, like a whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It crawled into his bones. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, but he couldn't stop himself. The pull was too strong. He couldn't explain it. He had to see it. He had to know. He stepped into the passage. Back in the bedroom, Laura stirred, half awake, her eyes fluttering open as she felt the emptiness beside her. Her hand reached for John, but the bed was cold. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. She had the strangest feeling. Something wasn't right. "John?" she called out softly, but there was no answer. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the old house. The sound of the baby's cry, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the walls again, but this time it didn't come from the nursery. It came from deep within the house, from the place that had never been meant to be found. And Laura was alone now. The darkness closed in around him as John moved through the hidden passage. His legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, his breath shallow and ragged. The faint, flickering light ahead called to him, beckoning him into the unknown. The walls of the passage were damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something older, something that clung to the very bones of the house. The baby's cry had stopped, replaced by a whispering sound that seemed to come from every direction, the kind of whisper that gnawed at the edge of your sanity. "She will return." The words from the letter echoed in his mind, mixing with the whispers around him. He couldn't shake them, couldn't stop the gnawing dread building up inside him. What had they moved into? What had they stumbled upon? The baby's cry, the letters, the hidden door. It was all too much, but he couldn't stop now. He couldn't turn back. As he rounded the corner of the narrow hallway, the flickering light grew brighter. It wasn't a lamp or a bulb, but something else, something far older. A candle. A single, flickering candle rested on the ground, casting its dim glow on a stone floor. The light was small, fragile, but it illuminated what lay ahead. The passage opened into a small, low-ceilinged room, its walls made of rough-hewn stone, the air stale with age. There were no windows, no escape, only the candle and the stone walls that seemed to close in on him. And in the center of the room, there was something he hadn't expected. A crib, the same crib from the nursery, the same wooden slats, the same worn padding. But this crib was different. It was ancient, the wood warped with age, darkened in places as though it had been touched by years of decay. The soft rustle of the blanket inside told him it was far from empty. John's heart thudded painfully in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He knew, somehow, what was inside. He stepped closer, drawn to it, unable to stop himself. The air grew colder as he moved, the light from the candle flickering as though it, too, was afraid. He leaned over the crib. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then the sound came again. The cry, a sharp, desperate wail, but there was no baby in the crib, no child. Instead, there was something else, a bundle wrapped tightly in a dark cloth, sitting still at the center of the crib. The cloth moved as though something within it was shifting, breathing, something alive, something that was waiting. He reached out, his fingers trembling, drawn to it. But as his hand touched the cloth, a chill shot up his spine, and he pulled back sharply. The air had turned ice cold, the whispers growing louder, swirling around him in a maddening cacophony. It wasn't just the house anymore. The walls were closing in on him, pressing down with a suffocating weight. And then, something began to stir inside the cloth. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the bundle began to unravel. John took an unsteady step back, his pulse racing as the cloth parted. What lay beneath wasn't a child. It was something else, a pale, malformed figure, its skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too long, too thin. It wasn't human. It was something twisted, something that shouldn't have been. Its eyes, large and unblinking, stared up at him, black as coal, empty. And as it opened its mouth, it wasn't a baby's cry that escaped. It was the sound of something ancient, something wrong. The figure in the crib twisted its head toward him, its neck cracking unnaturally, and then it spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper. "She will return." John recoiled, stumbling backward, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst from his chest. The walls of the room seemed to tremble, the stone vibrating with the force of an unseen presence. But as the creature in the crib stared at him, its face frozen in an unholy grin, a low guttural growl filled the air. The candle flickered one last time before it snuffed out, plunging the room into complete darkness. John's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't breathe. The growl grew louder, and then, just as quickly, it stopped. A silence hung in the air, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a silence that pressed against him, heavy and suffocating, like the silence before a storm. The figure in the crib was still, unmoving now, as if it had never existed in the first place. John stood there in the dark, trying to gather his bearings, but his body refused to obey. His legs shook with terror, and his mind was a blur of horror and confusion. Then he heard it again, a baby's cry, faint, distant, but unmistakable. And this time, it was coming from the nursery. The house seemed to tremble, the walls groaning, the very foundation of it shifting beneath him. He turned on his heel and bolted down the narrow hallway, his feet slipping on the wet stone. His heart was pounding so hard, he thought it would burst from his chest. The baby's cry was growing louder, closer, and he had to get out, had to get back to Laura. But as he ran, the walls began to close in on him, narrowing the passage, twisting the very air, until it felt like he was suffocating. Finally, he reached the door. He tore it open, only to be met by darkness. The hallway was empty, silent. It was gone. He stumbled backward into the nursery, his mind spinning, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Laura was standing there in the doorway. "John," she whispered, her voice shaky. "John, where did you go? What's happening?" He turned to her, his face pale, his hands trembling. He wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. All he could hear was the echo of the baby's cry, still ringing in his ears. "You have to get out," he said hoarsely. "We need to leave. Now." Laura blinked at him, confused. "What are you talking about? The baby?" "No," John shouted, his voice wild. "There's no baby. There's nothing here. And then he froze, because in the corner of the room, he saw something, a tiny hand, reaching out from behind the rocking chair. Slowly, almost deliberately, the hand moved, fingers stretching toward them, as if to beckon them closer. John's blood ran cold, and for the first time, he realized that the house was no longer just a place they lived. It had become something else, something alive, something that had claimed them, and there was no escaping it. Not anymore. The house was awake, and it was hungry.